Ladies and gentlemen, good morning. I invite you to please stand and adopt an appropriate posture for prayer. And I'd like to call Mrs. Lyra Thomas Joseph as she prays to commence our session this morning.
Lord Jesus, give us guidance, give us wisdom and understanding. And at the end of the day, let our day to be productive and successful. In the name of the Father, the Son, and of the Holy Spirit, I pray. Amen.
Cooperatives and Consumer Affairs, Honorable Emma Hippolyte. Our moderator for today, Dr. Adrian Auger, Economic Development Consultant. Our panelists, we have Executive Director of the St. Lucia Chamber of Commerce, Industry and Agriculture, Mr. Brian Louisi, Mr. Jason King, Treasurer of the St. Lucia Manufacturers Association, Dr. Tekla Fitzlewis, President of the National Consumers Association, Mr. Joseph Cox, Assistant Secretary General, CARICOM, joining us virtually, representatives of the various business associations and organizations, management and staff of the Ministry of Commerce and the Department of Finance, in-house and virtual audience, members of the media, ladies and gentlemen, good morning. Good morning. It's a beautiful day, and I'd like to thank you for joining us today as we have this very important discussion on inflation. Today, we will have a candid discussion as the members of our panel, they were not paid, so they will be very frank. And at the end of the day, we are hoping that after all is said and done, we can do our review. A lot has been done to deal with that elephant in the room called inflation, but we still like to include the members of the public. We would like to hear from you so that anything that we have not considered, we would like to consider your feedback so that we can continue to deal with that elephant in the room called inflation. At this time, I would like to invite our Honorable Minister, Minister Emma Hippolyte from the Ministry of Commerce, as she delivers the opening and welcome remarks. Minister.
Ministry of Finance and Commerce, Dr. Adrian Auger, distinguished who's our moderator for this session today, distinguished members of our panel, Ambassador Joseph Cox of CARICOM, Dr. Tekla Fitzlewis of the National Consumers Association, Mr. Brian Louisi, Director of the St. Lucia Chamber of Commerce and Industry, Mr. Jason King, Treasurer of the St. Lucia Manufacturers Association, staff of the Ministry of Commerce, I see the President of the Fashion Council, other staff of the Ministry of Finance, other members of our in-house audience, members of the media, those of you joining us via the live stream, esteemed ladies and gentlemen, friends and well-wishers. Particularly in this festive season, I want to wish you a warm and pleasant good morning to all of you. And we are here from this lovely Hotel Bellevue near the summit of the La Panse Hill in Castries, St. Lucia. And today we have taken some time out to come together to discuss a very topical and somewhat controversial subject, which has been on the lips of all citizens, not only of St. Lucia, not only of the OECS, not only of CARICOM, but of the world. In one way or another, over the past 2 years, between 2022 and 2023, we all have been having one conversation or another concerning different things. High prices, cost of living, we have our own terminology. But the subject in question is the experience by many of high and rising prices of goods and services across all sectors of our domestic economy, but more so in food, retail, and the distribution sectors. This sentiment regarding a marked and sustained increase in prices has been so widespread and broad-based that it has culminated in a crescendo of voices, even resulting in a petition, crying out in anguish and despair for some kind of intervention and relief from businesses and, of course, our government. In brief, the observed phenomenon of a great increase in the price of goods and services over a given period of time is what the economists call inflation. It is measured by percentage changes in the consumer price index, which captures movements in prices of items in our consumption basket. This basket is made up of various goods and services or sub-indices on which we typically spend our money, albeit in different proportions or weights on a monthly basis. And these sub-indices include 1, food and beverages, 2, shelter or housing, 3, clothing, 4, transportation, 5, health, 6, recreation or entertainment, 7, education, and 8, communications. Although some of these indices have moved more than others, they have all generally increased. As a result, we have been told by our statistics office that there has been some 6.3% increase in the average cost of this consumer basket. But where did this episode of inflation come from? Most of you have been asking, and some of you have been speculating. While there are many causes of inflation, such as increases in price of inputs or the money supply, the recent spike in inflation, which the world has been experiencing over the period 2021, 2023, has been largely attributed to the post-COVID era. As we recovered from COVID, you have as well disrupted global supply chains where we have been unable to respond or match the surge in global demands across many commodities, including oil and food, compounded by shipping delays and other logistics-related bottlenecks as economies reopen. This supply shortfall and imbalance in global markets serve to drive prices upward, resulting in a peak in global inflation in 2022, which ranged between 7.2 to 9.8%. In advanced economies such as the US, the Euro area, and emerging markets, the highest in decades. And in the US, up to last night on the news, it was saying it's the highest in 40 years. In St. Lucia's case, inflation likewise climbed to an unprecedented high, causing much anxiety and consternation among the population. But why should we care about inflation? What are some of the impacts of inflation? We, including the government, are concerned about inflation, and rightfully so, because it has a deleterious and negative impact on individuals and households in a number of ways. For example, it slows down economic growth. It reduces our purchasing power and increases the cost of living. Left unchecked, inflation also reduces the real value of our savings and makes creditors worse off, as the real value of debt payments reduces as inflation rises. For these and other reasons, inflation is in many ways against the grain of good macroeconomic management. Hence, central banks and governments around the world do all that is possible to take corrective action to contain inflationary impulses in an attempt to restore price stability, which is critical to the attainment of prosperity and economic growth. So today, why are we here? We felt it was important to have public outreach and consultation. And that is to help us make sense and better understand all of this and what we have all been experiencing in this country and the world over with respect to this problem, in terms of what it is, what caused it, its effect, and what we can expect going forward. The Ministry of Commerce has partnered with the Ministry of Finance to present to you this public consultation on this very pertinent subject of inflation. Given the esoteric nature of the subject matter, we have brought together a mix of technical expertise from within and outside the public service, and we have gone as far as CARICOM, which is going to bring us with, give us a regional perspective to engage us on the subject. In so doing, we begin with two presentations, which I am confident will dissect the anatomy of inflation in its local, regional, and international dimension, so that we can all get a better and more informed appreciation of this macroeconomic situation. The information to be presented to us in the presentations will provide an analytical context and point of departure, which our esteemed panelists can use as a launchpad to further elaborate on the issues raised under the able guidance of our distinguished moderator, Dr. Auger. This initiative, in which we have sought to reach out to engage the consuming public in a constructive dialogue on the subject of utmost importance, is part of my ministry and my government's approach to policy formulation, based on a more participatory and interactive relationship with our principal clients, namely yourself as consumers, as well the business community and the general public. Although, as I'm told, rates of inflation have shown signs of trending downwards across the world, in a number of major markets, as well as in St. Lucia, prices regrettably remain relatively high and above pre-pandemic levels. This is concerning given that wage and salaries have not kept pace with such price increases, resulting in an erosion of purchasing power, real incomes, and the net worth of individuals. So, notwithstanding, I think that today's exercise is time well spent, as there are lessons to be learned going forward from the information which will be shared with you, our audience, as we seek to help elucidate and demystify the subject of inflation. Meanwhile, the government will remain vigilant and continue to monitor this situation. We stand ready to take further measures in the incoming fiscal year. as may be necessary to supplement the policy actions which have already been implemented to help mitigate the effects of the inflation-induced price shocks, especially on the more vulnerable members of our society. And I can maybe remind you here of some of the things that our government has done to assist you, the consumer. Only on Tuesday, we went into Parliament to, first we had the passing of the consumer bill, consumer protection bill. Then Tuesday gone, we went in to amend that bill to provide authority for our ministry and our staff to obtain information from the business community. As a government, we have removed the 6% service charge on all price control goods. As a government, we continue to provide subvention on rice, flour, sugar, and cooking gas. Recently, our government removed VAT on building material as well as sanitary products. We have placed sanitary products under price control. On the government side, we have provided relief in tax arrears and fines so that our businesses themselves could maneuver through this difficult period. So you have a government that is very conscious of what is happening to our consumers, and we actively try to see how we can bring some soulagement to the people of St. Lucia. So finally, while our policies responding to deal with inflation have predominantly been from the perspective of protecting or advancing consumer welfare, we are also equally concerned about our business community as producers and providers of goods and services. With that in mind, we intend to work with our retailers, distributors, and manufacturers to strengthen the regulatory environment for the conduct of business in St. Lucia, so as to ensure the prevalence of ethical and fair trading practices, which will help to curb and suppress excessive price increases and, by extension, inflationary pressures in the economy. With no further ado, I would like to extend seasoned greetings to all of you and wish you a very productive and unfettered discourse on the subject before us, as we seek to hear from you and our panelists on this very important subject of inflation. Ladies and gentlemen, I thank you, and may God guide our discussion.
Also summarize the measures that have been implemented thus far to give some relief. We now have two presentations. One will be one of the presentations by Ms. Gemma Lafayette. Gemma is the Director of the Research and Policy Unit in the Department of Finance. And the second presentation will be done by Dr. Thomas Samuel. And Dr. Samuel is the Trade Advisor in the Ministry of Commerce. And this is to provide you with the facts and additional information so that persons will be well informed, and this will also set the tone for our panel discussion. So I'd like to invite Gemma Lafayette, followed by Dr. Samuel.
everyone, Honorable Minister Hippolyte, distinguished panelists, representatives of the Ministry of Finance, and the Ministry of Commerce, representatives from the business community, the online audience, and the public in general. Following through from the comments and the remarks by Minister Hippolyte, we would like to delve a bit deeper into dissecting what is the macroeconomic problem called inflation by taking a look at pretty much what is inflation, what are the causes generally of inflation, why is it a problem, and then we will basically move into looking at the inflationary trends globally, then regionally and also domestically within St. Lucia's economy. And we will briefly glance through the various measures that's been taken by the government of St. Lucia in mitigating the effects of inflation. And then we will end by basically presenting you with a brief outlook of inflation for the rest of this year and into 2024. So as the Minister Hippolyte has articulated quite well, inflation, as most of us know, is a general rise in the prices of goods and services in the domestic economy over time. And it has many causes. It is both driven by external factors as well as domestic factors. Generally, we have factors that affect demand for goods and services, and also factors that affect supply, in a sense that the cost and availability of producing some items, goods and services, are affected by a number of cost factors that affect various inputs into the production of goods and services, such as raw materials, inputs such as electricity and transport, as well as labor costs. The minister would have touched on the wage issue regarding the nexus between wages and inflation. And so, to the extent that inflation really reflects an imbalance between supply and demand at any given point in time, it really reflects the more dominant factor, whether it's supply or demand, that's actually driven us to a particular point to experience high inflation. So inflation, quite apart from inflation being an increase in the prices of goods and services, it really becomes a macroeconomic issue when inflation rises above a certain level. So generally, countries expect and encourage or desire to achieve moderate levels of inflation in a given year. However, when inflation surpasses that average or that limit, it begins to be problematic. When persons actually feel the pinch and in the pockets and their purchasing power, and it becomes more broad-based to a wider range of goods and services. It also creates quite a bit of uncertainty and affects the way consumers, businesses, investors behave, which then basically presents a problem for the economy going forward, as business confidence and consumer confidence could be affected, which would then impact the business or consumer's ability to spend and to basically encourage activity in the economy. In terms of how it is measured, the Central Statistics Office, which is commonly known as the Statistics Department, usually uses an index, what we call the Consumer Price Index, which is based on a household survey that is taken at a given point in time to reflect the average consumption of goods and services, a set basket of goods and services by the average household. These items are tracked on a monthly basis by the department and reported on a monthly basis. The basket includes a wide range of goods and services. While most persons would tend to think of inflation as only being the cost of goods, particularly what is sold at the supermarket, it's a lot broader concept than that, in the sense that it affects the cost of insurance, travel, communications, recreation, other services, and other goods, not commonly complained about in the general public. In terms of what has happened globally and what took us to where we are now, we will see that, for instance, in the wake or during the pandemic, countries that the countries that have actually, the advanced countries of the world, the major economies in the world, would have undertaken aggressive monetary policies to help calm down inflation and to basically bring some relief to the consumers and the citizenry. So just to provide you here with a pictorial impression of what has happened and transpired since COVID, we would see here from the graph on the left that inflation globally has escalated in 2022 from just about 4.7% in 2021 to about 8.7%. That represented a multi-decade increase. That's the highest inflation rate since the last 40 years. And in 2023, given having experienced a high and elevated level of inflation, as I said before, advanced economies, particularly central banks in those countries, would have taken many interventions to help bring down inflation and to basically achieve the macroeconomic goals for the economies. So as a result of those actions, we'd have seen a decline in the rate of inflation from 8.7% to 6.9%. I would just like to reiterate here that while we see inflation is declining globally, it does not mean that the prices are falling. It means that the prices are rising at a slower rate than we experienced in 2022. So then the question becomes, what led to that escalation in prices in 2022? Of course, in the wake of COVID, when there were lockdowns across the world, when economies reopened thereafter, when the vaccine was distributed and implemented across many countries, we see that the governments opening up would have created a strong demand, which exceeded the availability of the supply of goods across the world. Also, too, in providing some relief to persons during the COVID pandemic, governments around the world have embarked on significant fiscal stimulus to provide relief to the citizenry. And also, at the same time, from February, March of 2022, we saw that this situation was exacerbated by the Russia-Ukraine war. And then with that came higher oil prices and additional increases in food prices. In terms of looking closer at what were the specific factors that led to the increase that we saw from the middle of 2021 and throughout 2022, we see for sure that the lingering effects of the COVID pandemic would have contributed significantly to the escalation in prices across the world. So we'd have recalled that there were clogged ports across the world. Containers were stuck in some parts of the world, like China. As a result of that, there were order backlogs that countries were awaiting the orders that were actually put in before. Also, there were input bottlenecks, and there were also labor shortages as persons who have been affected by COVID, and also having experienced COVID, some persons did not return to the workforce. So these COVID-related issues created what we call a supply chain bottlenecks that we'd have experienced in that period. We also saw with that there was a heightened increase in the price of shipping to move containers across the world, and that would have contributed to the increase in the imported price of a lot of products across the world. And the freight cost is also linked to the escalation in oil prices and commodity prices, which would have been made worse by the Russia war in the first quarter of 2022. And quite apart from that, there were also some sectoral shifts in demand where most of these pressures, inflationary pressures or factors, would have eased somewhat in 2023. And some of that being the unwinding of fiscal stimulus by the governments. They had expired and come to an end. And also, too, that was coupled with the fact that the governments were also introducing interest rate increases to help cool down demand and hence suppress consumer spending. Just to show you here that the contribution, of course, to inflation in 2021-22 was towards the end of this quarter in 2023. Oil prices, you will recall, would have gone up from $68 a barrel in 2021 to about $95 a barrel in 2022. And in 2023, it has declined by just about 17% to just about $80 a barrel. Yeah, just to show you here, of course, what has happened. demand, we see that production in the non-OPEC countries would have increased substantially, particularly from the US, and of course some small contributions from Guyana in the region. Again, in 2022 especially, and so for the first quarter of 2023, we had the efforts by the OPEC countries, largely Saudi Arabia and Russia, to help prop up, keep prices of oil high. But these forces, or that factor, was counterbalanced by the efforts of the non-OPEC countries to increase production and put a downward pressure on prices. Again, just to indicate here that one of the major, quite apart from having the decline in commodity prices, many food and oil prices, another major contributor to the decline that we saw in inflation in 2023 was the continued tightening of monetary policy by the central banks around the world. So we see here on the graph that there was a steady increase in the policy interest rates by the central banks in the US, in Europe, Canada, and other major advanced economies. In the US specifically, which is our major trading partner, we see that the rates increases were 11 times during the course of, from March of 2022 to July of 2023. Moving from essentially 0% interest rate in March of 2022 to just about 5.25% in July. And it has remained at that rate since July as a result of the decision by the Federal Reserve to pause in the interest rate hikes, given that they are satisfied with the movements in inflation in the US, given that downward trend that has been reported. In the US, we saw that inflation would have actually declined from 8.1%, a peak of 8.1% in 2022, to just about an average of a 3.5% in 2023. And we see a similar pattern for the UK as well, although inflation has been a lot more stubborn in the UK than in the US, given that the UK and Europe is a lot more exposed to the effects of the war that is closer to them than the US. And also, we see in the other major economies like China, not much differences in inflation given their own economic situation there. And Canada, a similar pattern. In terms of how those external environment, economic environment has affected the regional economy, we see that similar pattern reflected in our regional performance. Whereas, given that we are open economies, all of us, St. Lucia and the rest of the region, countries in the region, we see that we also experience a tempering of inflation, a lower inflation rate in 2023. But again, prices remain elevated above pre-pandemic levels. We've zeroed in a bit on the specific region, the sub-region, the ECCU, where we have show you on the graph on the left here that all countries experience that escalation in inflation in 2022, and we see some early signs of a sustained decrease in 2023, more so in the second half of 2023. In Dominica, for instance, we see here that the rate has moved from 9% when we compare June of 2023 to June of 2022 to just about 3.6%. And the same in Antigua, from 10.5% to just about 2.8%. St. Lucia has a similar trend as is the other countries, except for a few countries where we see a similar performance for inflation, more so in Barbados when we get to the non-ECCU discussion. So for the year as a whole, for all of 2023, including the projection for the last quarter of 2023, we see here the similar pattern as we saw in the global economy, that inflation would have peaked in almost all the countries in the region in 2022 and started to come down in 2023. So for St. Lucia, we see here a similar pattern as the other countries, and also in the non-ECCU countries, Barbados, Jamaica, Guyana. Barbados would have some of an exception in the sense that it had experienced some effects from the tropical storms on some of the adverse weather patterns which affected agricultural produce in that country. And also there was a rapid increase in the demand for services when the economy actually opened up somewhat later than St. Lucia. In terms of how all of that has actually come to bear on St. Lucia's economy and what we have experienced here in St. Lucia regarding the price movements, we see a similar pattern, that prices are beginning to increase at a slower rate, but still remain at much higher levels than an average consumer would like. So of course, being open and vulnerable to all of the vagaries in the international environment, we see here that the global monetary policy does have an effect with a lag in St. Lucia. We also see that the movements in freight costs has an impact on our imported price of goods. We also see here that the increase in production would have been affected by higher electricity costs and transport costs and raw materials as well in 2022. And the reverse would have happened in 2023, where we would have seen that, for instance, electricity cost closely linked to the cost of crude oil prices would have gone down in 2023 vis-a-vis 2022. And there are also some other factors that are domestic and specific to the region and St. Lucia that would have created inflationary pressures. We'd have seen, as more persons came back to work following the COVID lockdowns in St. Lucia, employment increased, and with that led to increased aggregate income amongst persons. Persons have more money to spend. And that would have actually put pressure on the prices as demand would have been high. We also see some effects on agriculture produce, where the availability of some of the produce would have been affected by Tropical Storm Brett earlier in 2023, and with that, we'd have seen some increases in agriculture prices. We also have another factor that affects inflation domestically and everywhere else, is also any movements in the government's tax policy, and the tax increases would also tend to contribute to an increase in prices. And we also see here that persons' ability to spend is also affected by any increase that's been given in credit, whether it's in the form of loans through credit unions, banks, and other financial institutions, would help increase demand and thereby put upward pressure on prices. So in St. Lucia, we see here as at September, when we compare September with September, we see that the inflation rate would have gone down from 7.6% a year ago to just about 2%, 2.6% in 2023. And the major components of that really is the food would have contributed to about a quarter of the increases that we'd have seen. And we also see here in St. Lucia that one of the same factors that contributed to the increase in 2022, which is utilities and gas and fuels, would have been reversed to some extent, where we saw decreases in these products in 2023. And that would have contributed to the slowing down of the rate of increase in prices in St. Lucia. Just to illustrate here more specifically what has happened with a major input cost that most persons deem to be very high in St. Lucia, which affects production costs as well as affects households in the form of their residential electricity bills. We could see here that the domestic rates, the graph on the left, would have shown there by the dotted line in red that the electricity rates are substantially lower in 2023 from April compared to the same months in 2022. And that, again, is as a result of the decline in world oil prices, which is reflected in the decline in the price at which Lucelec would have imported diesel to generate electricity in St. Lucia. And there's almost an immediate pass-through with about a month lag that where consumers would actually see that reflected on their bills through what is called the surcharge that really reflects the adjustments in the imported price of diesel. And a similar pattern was seen for commercial rates, which is the cost, which affects the cost of production of goods and services in St. Lucia. So businesses would have benefited or would have gotten some sort of relief in 2023 from a slightly lower oil prices, which are down by electricity prices down about 5% in 2023 vis-a-vis 2022. For St. Lucia overall, as we would have shared earlier for the other countries, we expect that on average, that the consumer price index would have changed or increased by just about 4.2%, and that compares with a high of 6.4 in 2022. So we do see that the rate of inflation is coming down, but it's still not at the rate as pre-COVID levels. Prior to COVID, or even during COVID, we had some years of what we call deflation, where prices actually declined. But for the most part, we are still above the desired rates of inflation. And we do expect that to continue to fall gradually into the next year coming. So in terms of having that experience of inflation, particularly in 2022, and it's continued in 2023, the question then is, what has the government done to basically provide some relief and to cushion consumers from the effects of this rising prices. The minister would have touched on some of it, but I guess I will take you through some additional measures that were undertaken. For the Ministry of Commerce, there were elevated levels of subsidies on the rice, flour, and sugar. The government warehouse would have purchased particularly flour at a much higher price in 2022 and kept prices domestically unchanged for quite a while before the prices were increased to a very small extent and still way below the price at which the government actually purchases those bulk items. So sugar, to some extent, was also subsidized, and also rice. In total, the government would have spent just approximately $15 million in the fiscal year 22-23 on subsidizing those items, and with a slight increase in the retail price of some of them, we'd have seen that the costs would have gone down, but still very high at $11 million in this financial year 23-24. The government would have also undertaken to waive the 6% customs service charge at the border on the imports of price control items during the months of June to October of 2022. Also, in order to assist some government workers in the cost of transport and the ease of transport, the government would have actually provided vehicle concessions to certain categories of workers, travel officers, customs officers, correctional officers, essential workers like doctors, nurses, police officers. And also the government would have actually given 2 sorts of one-off increases to pensioners whose incomes are fixed. These are pensioners in the government payroll. And we'd have seen an increase of it's granted to pensioners of about $600 in October of 2022 and in November of 2023, both together costing just about $3.5 million in total. And of course, the government subsidy on LPG continued, but it was also increased significantly, given that the price of oil or the imported price of cooking gas would have gone up significantly in 22-23. So the government would have subsidized on average the price of the 20-pound cooking gas cylinder by almost $20 a cylinder. And while it has gone down a bit in 23-24, in this financial year, it is still high at $15 per cylinder. That has cost the government just about $13 million in the year 22-23, and just about $11 million is projected for this financial year, 23-24. Added to that, and to assist persons in coping with the inflationary situation, the government would have actually honored the agreed salary increases and paid those increases that were deferred for the triennium 2019-20 to 21-22. And these were all paid for the last 2 years of the triennium in the year 22-23. For this year, 2023 more specifically, the government would have continued its efforts to provide relief by embarking on personal income tax reform, whereas many persons were taken off the tax net. They were not their salaries were not subjected to the payment of income tax. And the government would have done that by increasing the threshold from 18,000 to 25,000, meaning that all persons now earning 25,000 and less would be paying no income tax. So that has provided a lot of relief to persons in terms of providing them with additional spending power. And that started in January of 2023. Furthermore, in the government's budget announcements this year, the government would have implemented the waiver of VAT on building materials, select building materials for a period of 2 years from August of 2025. And a similar thing was done for solar PV systems to help persons from a more long-term view reduce their electricity bills by beginning to invest in solar PV systems, and also contributing to the agenda and the mandate for climate change compliance. The government also, this month, would have, as announced, also is about to provide many taxpayers with income tax refunds, in the order of about additional $10 million in the form of income tax refunds. In a given year, the government normally budgets about $10 million for income tax refunds, but for this financial year, that budget is expected to more than double to basically help persons to have additional spending power at this point in time. Additionally, for producers in the agricultural sector, the government would have increased the fuel rebate to fishermen from $1 to $2.50 per gallon, and also the teacher material allowance that's given in every September, August, September, was increased by $600 to $1,400 to every teacher at a cost to the government. In terms of the inflationary environment now and where we see prices heading, more globally and also, of course, in St. Lucia, we expect that prices will continue to actually, the rate of increase in prices, which is inflation, is expected to continue to decrease. And this term is normally called disinflation. It is not deflation, but it's disinflation, where prices are still increasing, but it's increasing at a slower rate. Globally, we expect that the inflation rate is expected to basically move from 6.9% in 2023 to just about, I can't see the screen, 5.8. Yeah, sorry. Yeah, it's about 5.8%. And for the years beyond that, in 2025, it is expected to move towards the inflation targets of about 2% in going forward. And we see the same thing, particularly this efforts have been led by the US, the largest economy in the world, the US economy. And we have heard in the news yesterday when the Federal Reserve signaled that although they've continued a pause in interest rates increases, that there is a possibility that there may be interest rate decreases in 2024. But that remains to be seen, and hereby contribute to a spiral, or basically set in motion the transmission mechanism for inflationary pressures to increase even further. Also added to that, we have what's happening in China, which is the second largest economy in the world, where China's economic issues with the real estate sector has presented some problems and has been a drag on the economy, and that is also presenting some downward pressure as well on prices. So with that, we expect that in St. Lucia, that inflation is likely to return to its pre-COVID norms of just around between 2 to 3% in 2024. But again, of course, that is subject to many different risks. We have, of course, the many ongoing wars around the world. If there's any escalation in the Ukraine-Russia war, also the Hamas-Israel war, and also more closer to us, how the issue with Venezuela and Guyana plays out, we may experience additional inflationary pressures for some periods of time in 2024. Also, Russia and Saudi Arabia have continued the efforts to basically constrict or reduce the supply of oil so as to increase the price at which oil is being sold. That any further increases in the production cuts, could cause inflation if these cuts are not made up by excess production elsewhere around the world. And of course, we have the tensions between China and Taiwan, China being a major producer of goods across the world. That could affect the availability and the distribution of goods and also the prices. And we're also vulnerable to natural disasters and the climate change effects could continue to disrupt the supply and price of agricultural produce. And we also have the factors regarding wages could also contribute to higher increases in the prices. But again, like I indicated just a while ago, that are there any changes in the sentiments by the central banks around the world to not only just stop the increases in interest rates, but to basically decrease that? That would also contribute to an additional pressure to bring prices down around the world. So with that, I will conclude by saying that inflationary pressures are expected to persist, but at a much more subdued rate. And also just for the listeners to bear in mind that while the government has done and undertaken several measures to mitigate the effects of inflation, we need to also be mindful of the fact that the government has to pursue many different macroeconomic objectives, quite apart from providing a seen after price stability and maintaining macroeconomic stability in general. The government not only would seek to provide relief to consumers, but the government also has to generate sufficient revenue to cover the cost of the production of goods and services and its operations in general. That is for education, health, security, and the like. And the government also has to keep a very close eye on its maintaining fiscal and debt sustainability so that the government could basically continue to have access to concessional sources of financing and to reduce its borrowing cost. So with that, I would stop and pause here and allow the second presenter to continue the discussion. Thank you.
To adopt the protocol that has been established in acknowledging the presence of the Minister, Honorable Hippolyte, Minister of Commerce, our distinguished panelists and the moderator, and of course our in-house guests and those of you joining us online. I could say to you that I'll be rather brief, a lot shorter. I know we have had quite a full treatment of the drivers and sources of inflation that we have observed the last 2 years. In this presentation, I will just try to focus more on what we call the sort of a micro perspective, bringing the lens of scrutiny to bear closer on the actual products that we consume, and which I think might be of interest to most of you. You would understand, of course, our price build-up process. As a small open economy, we have imported goods that land at our shores with something called the CIF value, which is cost, insurance, freight, and you heard about freight earlier on, and I would come to that a bit later on, which serve as our input prices, to which border charges are added to give us something called landed costs, and then thereafter the business or importer would apply some level of margin to cover costs and remain profitable. The Ministry of Commerce, through its Department of Consumer Affairs, basically has the mandate to promote consumer welfare, and as we indicated earlier on, but also to pay attention to the environment to ensure our businesses are also thriving and in a sort of supportive environment. But in this occasion, our focus is on the consumer welfare aspect of our mandate. That is done through the Distribution and Price of Goods Act, Cap 13 of 09. Now, here we spend some time looking at monitoring prices, prices in particular those on the price control list. So I'll start looking at this. I'll start with oil, cooking oil. Cooking oil, we saw that the price of cooking oil climbed from about $17 to about $45. It more than doubled, an increase of over 165%. And that, if you notice the period from about April 2020, which is in the sort of in the middle of the COVID era or period, right up to $45.80 in December of 2022, which is last year. So we had that precipitous rise. Again, similar pattern, pasta, another product that is widely consumed in our diet. Again, starting from about March, which is in the COVID era, for various reasons, increased to about $30.81 over up till last month. Now, I want to say something about pasta. Pasta is a product that is subjected to a special regime in the region. We have something called, in CARICOM, Article 164, where we seek to promote industrial development in LDCs, including St. Lucia, so domestic producers benefit from some tariff protection. And that too is, might be included there, especially on imported varieties. Tuna fish is one of a commonly used source of protein. Prices here also increased on 3.5 ounce tins of tuna, starting from an average price of about 2.53 or $2.53, up to about a high of 3.5. Now, I want you to bear in mind that this is a price control item. So it means that there's just a fixed percentage margin, wholesale and retail margin. And if it increases, it can only increase for one reason. That is, the CIF value would have had to increase, the input price. And that is what this is really showing us. But again, the same pattern that was alluded to early on by the Ministry of Finance, from about this September, last quarter of last year, into the first quarter, we saw the general deceleration of prices trending downwards. Okay. We go to hygiene and sanitary product, toilet soap. There too, same pattern. We see that the retail price of soap are going from an average of $2.34 a bar to $3.09. Cornflakes, a cereal, a breakfast item. We see various brands and sizes of cornflakes also demonstrate a general upward trend of about a 5% increase every few months. So we see that general pattern holding across different a sample of different products, whether they be hygiene, dietary or otherwise. Now, I want to jump ahead to another point that was alluded to earlier on as a driver of cost, and that is freight or shipping costs. And the reasons for that have been discussed. Bottlenecks at ports, as a result of the public health measures that would have affected workers and created labor shortages. We had truck drivers unavailable, containers and so forth. All of those factors would have affected scheduling of ship deliveries and so forth. And so that is a major factor. But in particular, we saw from the US market, which is our main trading partner, that prices again climbed from March of 2021 all up the way to December of 2022. But after that, we saw some sort of a leveling off and slightly trending downwards slightly. It was a more precipitous climb in China, starting from about mid 2020, from about 12,000 EC thereabout, and the prices increased steadily throughout 2021 to a maximum of about 39,000 in January of 2022. Quite a climb. And thereafter, you saw the same pattern, prices of freight, cost of freight, going down to leveling off to about $18,474 for a 40-foot container of goods out of China. So in essence, ocean freight costs really has shown the effects of the pandemic, climbing, as I said, high up to about US $14,640, and in the US market from about 4,225. Thereafter, petering out or increasing at a slower rate and coming down, as I indicated. The reasons for that have already been discussed earlier on. So in summary, and I know people like that word, in practice, the pattern of price movements have been largely the same and increased during the sort of COVID era, and depending on the rate at which measures take effect, sometimes with a lag, we can see the peaks being probably a quarter or two different in terms of the time, and thereafter trending downwards to where we are. Because essentially all agencies, all companies are taking action. They're all acting to try to correct the imbalance, correct the dislocation, minimize the dislocation. Whether it's government policy, we heard about central banks, and companies also trying to remain viable by being competitive. So all of these things have helped to bring price down. But there's another factor I want to draw to your attention. Despite the reduction in freight costs, prices, CIF values are still somewhat higher than pre-COVID levels, and that's why we say prices are sticky downwards. Unless we have some mechanisms to ensure pass-through, we don't have the full pass-through. Some of the companies may internalize what we call the economic rents. So that is the anatomy, that is the story, ladies and gentlemen, of the inflation experience that we have had. I could say to you the ministry is committed to continue to monitor prices, and as the minister indicated in her remarks, stands ready to take any sort of additional action that may be necessary in the fiscal year 2024-25. And finally, another aspect of this issue is that we intend to continue to work to enhance, first of all, the ministry's capacity in competition, as well as to establish the necessary legislative and regulatory framework to help better enforce competition policy and rules, and to ensure fair trading and ethical business conduct in St. Lucia. With these few words, I want to thank you for your attention, and I would now hand you over to the Permanent Secretary. Thank you very much for your attention.
And a few days ago, somebody said to me, I just want to know what will be done about these prices, for the prices to decrease in the supermarket, etc. But you could, from the presentations, I'm sure you'll agree, this is not a simple matter. And a lot has been done to date to offer some relief, to give consumers more spending power. So at this time, I'd like to introduce the members of our panel. We look forward to their presentation. I don't know what will be their contribution. I look forward to their presentation. I'll begin with our moderator. Dr. Adrian Auger is an economic development consultant with extensive private and public sector experience across the Caribbean and beyond. He has worked as an economist with the governments of St. Lucia and Grenada, the World Bank, the European Union, UNCTAD, USAID, CARICOM, and the OECS. As chief economist in the Ministry of Finance and Planning, Dr. Auger served as economic policy advisor to the Prime Minister of St. Lucia, establishing the Office of Private Sector Relations, OPSR, and designing and implementing the country's first private sector development strategy. He also served as Deputy National Authorizing Officer for St. Lucia's Official Grant Assistance Program with the European Union, and was the architect and first Secretary General of St. Lucia's National Economic Council. He's a former Executive Director and Vice President of the St. Lucia Chamber of Commerce, Industry and Agriculture, an institution that he helped to transform during his 5-year tenure. Dr. Auger has worked at the World Bank as an economic assistant to the Executive Director for Canada, Ireland, and the Caribbean, and has served as director on the boards of several public institutions and private companies. He is currently a director of Surgical Life Eastern Caribbean, the JQ Charles Group of Companies, and Landmark Group, of which he is chair and founder. Poet, playwright, producer, mass man, and cultural activist, Dr. Auger is St. Lucia's first Caribbean laureate of arts and letters, and has been conferred with several prestigious awards, including the St. Lucia Medal of Merit Gold, Service Exporter of the Year 2009, Entrepreneur of the Year 2010, and an honorary doctorate from the University of the West Indies. Join me in welcoming Dr. Auger, our moderator for today. Active in the fields of private sector development, business advocacy, business support services, trade negotiations, export development, sustainable development, development planning, and competitiveness throughout his professional career. Mr. Luisi has a first degree in economics from Syracuse University in New York and a master's degree in national development and project planning from Bradford University in the United Kingdom. Welcome, Mr. Luisi. Our next panelist, Mr. Jason King, is a chartered accountant with 28 years of experience in the accounting and finance profession. He has been the Chief Financial Officer of the St. Lucia Distillers Group of Companies for the past 12 years and also serves in the role of Company Secretary. He previously worked at the St. Lucia ANC Ports Authority for nearly 16 years, serving as the Deputy Financial Controller for the last 7 years of his tenure, which included performing the role of financial analyst. Mr. King is currently the second Vice President of the St. Lucia Chamber of Commerce, Industry and Agriculture and serves on the executive of the St. Lucia Manufacturers Association as Treasurer, positions he has held for several years. He's a fellow of the Association of Chartered Certified Accountants and has an MBA from the University of Leicester. Join me in welcoming Mr. Jason King, our next panelist. Our sole female panelist for today, Dr. Tekla Fitzlewis. Dr. Fitzlewis is a distinguished professional whose extensive educational journey and over 3 decades of executive experience have solidified her reputation as a prominent figure in management consultancy, business development strategies, and human resource development. Her academic accolades include the attainment of a master's and doctorate from the University of Leicester in the UK and Walden University in the USA, respectively, complemented by an array of certifications spanning various fields from strategic human resource management and developmental training, management consultancy, leadership and organizational psychology, international marketing, business administration, and hotel and restaurant technologies. Her diverse career path has seamlessly transitioned between the public and private sectors, showcasing her versatility. Certainly, Dr. Fitzlewis serves as the Director of Operations and Human Capital Management at Lewis Industries Limited in St. Lucia, and is also CEO and Principal Consultant of Lewis Management Consultancy Services. Furthermore, Dr. Fitzlewis' commitment to professional excellence is underscored by her active participation on numerous boards and within various professional affiliations. As the proud president of the National Consumer Association, she continues to champion consumer rights, exemplifying her dedication to personal and professional growth while consistently striving for excellence. Her active engagement in these organizations underscores her unwavering dedication to the development of people, organizations, and country. Let's welcome Dr. Fitzlewis. So I now move on to Zoom platform. I extend a warm welcome to Mr. Joseph Cox. He's the Assistant Secretary General, Economic Integration, Innovation and Development at the Caribbean Community Secretariat. An applied economist consultant and advocate with a career spanning 30 years, Mr. Joseph Cox is currently the Assistant Secretary General at CARICOM Secretariat in Georgetown, Guyana. A Jamaican national, he holds both a bachelor's degree and a master's degree in economics from the University of the West Indies. His contribution to regional development has included the recent authoring of a book entitled The New Normal, a post-COVID primer for business, conceptualized and received unanimous approval from COTED of the Made in CARICOM initiative. There's development and successful execution to the Caribbean Center for Renewable Energy and Energy Efficiency of a project preparation facility. Also, the development and implementation of a regional strategic intervention framework dubbed the Program of Technical Assistance to CARICOM Territories, which boasts short, medium, and long-term intervention strategies designed to optimize economic impact in CARICOM member states, coupled with a robust monitoring and evaluation system. So prior to his CARICOM Secretariat posting, Mr. Joseph Cox was a managing partner for the Center for Growth and Development in Jamaica, and also as the Executive Director, Growth Secretariat at the Planning Institute of Jamaica, and he provided oversight for the Inter-American Development Bank, IDB, Government of Jamaica Competitiveness Enhancement Program. Join me in welcoming Mr. Joseph Cox, our virtual participant, our virtual panelist for today. Thank you, Mr. Cox, for joining us, and I'm sure you will agree this is a very knowledge, experience-rich panel. We had to sum up all of the bios, or else I would have taken hours to present. So we are very grateful and we are very happy to have such an experienced group of persons, experts who will be discussing that topic of inflation, and also to ensure at the end of the day
are impacted by this evil, the secret thief it's called, or the quiet thief, inflation. I want to commend the Ministries of Finance and Commerce for initiating this discussion. I think it's a matter that the public is deeply interested in every time they go to the shops, every time they look at an invoice, every time they consider their production curves. And so it is fitting that we should have this discussion and that we should have it as a community. So I think that's very good. I would like to note that we are approximately 35 minutes behind time, and unless we're extending the closing, Madam Master of Ceremonies, I suggest that we use our time as profitably as possible. I would therefore like to welcome my fellow panelists and ask each one in the order that we are seated to begin with some brief opening remarks, focusing, I presume, primarily on their own sectors and their institutional perspectives, and then we will go to a broader discussion on the various subtopics of inflation. So it is my pleasure to ask Mr. Brian Louisi, Executive Director of the Chamber of Commerce, to lead us off. I think it's appropriate that he start, given his broader perspective on the private sector itself and the impact of inflation on a wide range of businesses across the economy. So over to you, Brian.
With aggravated customers, because the fancy term inflation really translates into higher prices to the consumer every time they go shopping. In the food sector, it is something that happens even more intensely because we buy food virtually every day, much more often. But those of us who have been brave enough to engage in even some simple construction projects, we too see the price escalation that has taken place. And the Chamber has phrased the problem as price escalation rather than just inflation, because we have seen prices and the cost of doing business escalate. And the reality is that these costs are passed on to consumers. We are very happy that the ministry has outlined very clearly the cause and the source of this price escalation we're experiencing. And so, as our members have tried, the institution has tried, and one of the last things we did was recently talk to our members about looking at different sources of supply for their goods. At our last AGM 2 weeks ago, we started talking about the whole issue of Latin America as a source of supply, so we could avoid some of the supply chain bottlenecks that people are experiencing, see lower cost of freight, but also see higher cost and better quality goods at a lower cost from Latin America. Because with the Russia war, with what's happening in Israel, a lot of firms have already started shifting their manufacturing to Latin America, to Mexico, because they're seeing that they have an ability to avoid a lot of the problems they're seeing. And so we're joining that factor and trying to find solutions, find ways we can mitigate the price escalation we're seeing. So we're happy to be here, and we hope we can offer some positive comments to the whole discussion.
Thank you, Brian. Moving right along, Mr. Jason King.
Okay. So I'm here to speak on behalf of local manufacturers. Which we have to grapple with. Now, of course, we need to remain, it's paramount that we remain competitive in the local market and internationally. So it doesn't mean for us it's not an automatic decision of simply passing on costs. For various reasons, we are often constrained in our ability to do so. Because it is really the market forces that dictate the extent to which we can pass on costs that dictate our pricing decisions. We compete, at a global level, really. Even when we compete in the local market, we are faced with competition from imported products that are produced by global suppliers, global manufacturers that benefit from economies of scale because they have huge factories compared to our tiny factories. They usually have lower energy costs and also lower labor costs. Sometimes because it's a combination of automation and genuinely lower wage rates. So with all of these challenges, we have to find a way through, but it certainly is a challenge. The Ministry of Finance already gave a lot of information about what drives inflation and drives those costs, but I can give you maybe specific examples from where I sit. So we heard about how raw materials have increased significantly, the cost, and then that was also driven by higher freight costs. Now, in terms of raw materials, some of these are commodities, and commodities are particularly affected by the rise in shipping costs. I can give you an example. I am from St. Lucia Distillers, and I can tell you that in 2022, the cost of molasses increased. It jumped by 51%. In one go. And for those of you who know a bit about the production of alcohol, molasses is the main ingredient in rum production. So you can see how this would have impacted us. And it is not, again, as I say, it's not possible to simply pass that on. We wouldn't want to, and in fact we can't. So it means having to absorb some of these costs. So while the consumers complain, and rightly so, at the increase in prices, significant increases in the prices on the shelves of everything, but there must be an understanding that, in fact, the businesses are not actually passing everything on. At least most of them are not. It means lower margins for most of us, and we just have to find a way to still keep our businesses running.
Thank you. I see everybody's following my instruction and keeping it brief, so I want to thank you for that. We'll be back on track very shortly. Tekla, if you could take over, lead us.
Definitely. As the soul rose between the thorns, let me take the opportunity to join the moderator and my fellow panelists in congratulating the Ministry of Consumer Affairs in seeing the relevance of facilitating such a consultation through discussion this morning. We recognize that inflation can have various effects on consumers, influencing their purchasing power, their savings, their overall financial well-being. However, my role this morning will be to show how consumers can play an effective role in light of inflation. Whilst inflation is primarily influenced by macroeconomic factors, which have been well articulated by the two speakers this morning, and factors which include government policies, consumers themselves can take certain steps to navigate and mitigate its impact on their personal finances. And the good thing is that consumers are also represented by my fellow panelists. Manufacturers are consumers. The members of the chamber are consumers. We all are consumers. So as we go through the process, I will highlight some ways that we consumers can play a role in inflation.
Thank you very much. And now we have Mr. Joseph Cox, Assistant Secretary General, CARICOM, joining us virtually. Welcome, Mr. Cox. I should remind you that you are bound by the same time.
Thank you very much. I trust you can hear me.
Can't physically reach. Sound, please check the sound.
You hearing me?
We're hearing you now, sir. Go ahead.
All right, wonderful. Thank you so much. First of all, for inviting us. We do appreciate it, and of course, I join you, Chair, in your commendations of the presenters earlier. And indeed, as I say, good morning to all present. I just want to make just a couple of observations because my perspective, of course, I'm not going to be speaking to the St. Lucian experience. But I will be looking at the issue right across the region. And part of the challenge I think that we're facing as we will confront the issue of inflation is also one of measurement. Because to be frank with you, in too many countries, the composition of the basket of goods that will be used as to determine the index, and a lot of times they are not updated in a timely manner. The weightings are therefore skewed, and therefore we have some challenges. There's also an issue where I would contend, just by looking at the information across the region, that there is need for us to have producer price indices, because obviously the price of the inputs that go into, for example, manufacturing process will be will be completely different, I would think, from that would obtain to regular consumer items. So that's one aspect of it. We also have to look at the notion of efficiencies within our markets. There are great opportunities for some efficiencies to be realized. So, for example, coming out of the COVID experience, there is a golden opportunity right across this region for us to be engaged in nearshoring, which the IDB from a recent study has pointed to as a potential $5 billion US market. There's also the other issue that I want to raise in this opening salvo as we look at matters of efficiencies and partnerships is that, for example, in a number of scenarios, the partnership between the government and the private sector becomes paramount. Because frankly speaking, if the state decides to waive duties, reduce duties, etc., but then what you have is basically a compensatory mechanism being employed by the private sector, if they are not on board with it, you can end up nullifying effects and therefore just giving away revenue for no reason. So there is need for us to have, I would think, a real detailed look at where the market is, what is going on. And of course, I have to sympathize in some respects with both the producers as well as the policymakers, because right across the region, we are looking at probably a 40 to 60% informality rate. So I stop there.
Informality.
Joseph, could you just repeat that last point, please? We seem to have lost you.
I think it's
Informality rate?
I'm not hearing.
We're hearing you. We are
Okay.
hearing you. Please go ahead. Just repeat your last point, please. Go ahead, Mr. Cobbs.
No, I don't mind. I'll stop there. It's just to point out that because we have the high degrees of informality across the region, the policy making space becomes very, very challenging, and therefore we have to take that into consideration as well.
Okay, is our sound all right? Can you hear us, Mr. Cobbs? Doesn't seem to hear us. Okay, so we're going to go ahead anyway. Jackie, see what you can do about that for us, please. All right. Brian, as you continue your delivery, I would like you to enunciate on the points that you have already outlined, but also to give us some kind of idea of how feasible Latin America is as an alternative source for raw materials, for inputs for consumer goods, and given perhaps the nature of instability rearing its head in the Guyana Venezuela situation, whether that is a realistic option, or are we jumping from the fire into the frying pan, or the frying pan into the fire?
You asked me to further some of the points I raised. I think these points will be discussed generally as we speak. But because we have a little high from the AGM in our discussion with Mexico and Brazil, I think there is potential because Brazil and Mexico are two of the largest economies and two of the largest exporters and manufacturers in the world, and they're number 1 and 2 in Latin America. Brazil is one of the largest exporters to the US, Mexico as well. A lot of the products you buy from the US, much more than you believe, are manufactured in Mexico. Mexico is actively pursuing dealing with some of the logistic challenges of shipping from Mexico and not having to go through Miami. Mexico is the largest producer of white goods. For example, refrigerators, televisions, washing machines, all of that. Mexico, I think, is the 3rd or 4th largest exporter of agricultural products to the US. So I think there's real potential and there's real appetite in countries like Mexico. Mexico particularly has a different approach to how it deals with its international partners, and I think they are willing to work. So there's that. Brazil, I do think there is an issue that we have to look at with the Guyana, Venezuela challenge. But also a lot of people say, but Brazil is so far away. But that's if you're dealing with South Brazil. North Brazil, you have roadways straight into Guyana that are already being explored, and they're being exploited by certain countries in the Caribbean. So I think, again, if our traditional suppliers are expensive and we have challenges getting from them, we need to raise our head and look otherwise. We have free trade agreements with Chile, with Costa Rica. These are booming manufacturing industries. We have free trade agreements with Santo Domingo. I have argued that we need to revisit whether there is benefit in rethinking, especially in this crisis time, the need for us to have non-reciprocity in terms of, whilst we can export duty-free to some of these countries, we don't have any obligation of being duty-free. But if there is a financial advantage to our consumers and our people, our producers and whatnot, we should examine it. I mean, we may come to the point where it doesn't make sense, but we should not just think that the best way in a modern trade environment is non-reciprocity. I think we need to examine it.
Okay, that's a good point. But how feasible do you think non-reciprocity is for us? I mean, it would constitute some kind of developmental transfer, concessionary trade agreement in our favor.
Well, we already have free trade agreements with some of these countries.
On a reciprocal basis?
On a non-reciprocal basis, where we don't pay duties if we export to them. And there are a whole line of items which
we can charge
we charge duties on. Okay, so we need to examine that list. We need to examine if there is possible.
So your point there also raises the logistics of shipping. Now, one of the things that has plagued us with interregional trade has been the cost and frequency and reliability of shipping between even our countries of CARICOM. How do you see that emerging, changing in the environment today, where we are seeing increased opportunities in terms of availability of product, yes, but the logistics of getting it from one country to the other, do you see that improving within the regional context?
I think there's enough.
By region, I'm saying Caribbean.
Caribbean. Yeah, I think there's enough work being done for us to see incremental movement. We're not going to have a wholesale shift or wholesale improvement. If, however, we're seeing St. Vincent, we're seeing Antigua, you're seeing Trinidad benefiting from trading and shipping from these markets, it is not impossible or not worth our while to explore.
Okay, so before we move, just talk a little bit about developing a critical mass, because it clearly, if we take this on a regional basis, whereas a region we are looking to shift trading patterns, then there's going to be a critical mass of goods moving such that shipping lines and traders and brokers and people like wholesalers are going to be more interested in targeting that end of the market. So, and remember, we're talking to our domestic audience as well. Break it down and outline what you see as the likely sequence of events for shifting sourcing from crisis areas like the Middle East. How do you see that playing out in real practical terms for our governments and eventually for our consumers?
I truly believe that legislation and institutional changes follow action. So we are already seeing, without the ideal situation in legislation and infrastructure, it's starting to happen. We are seeing the major developing countries, the US and European countries, shifting production to Mexico for that very same reason. Mexico itself, Latin America itself, has been promoting, and they are promoting even more, South-South trade as a philosophical approach to development. We are seeing persons already doing it through Brazil. Just when I was making contact to have APEX, which is the Brazilian Industrial and Export Promotion Agency, speak to us, I was put in touch with somebody who's already doing it as a business. So I think it can be done. Again, I'm saying if we are first to market, St. Lucia is well located to be the hub for the South Caribbean, for the Eastern Caribbean, as we have a duty-free zone. What is the potential of utilizing that? So I think there needs to be some intellectual capital invested in looking at the situation and not being deterred that we don't have this, we don't have that. A lot of things we have, we didn't have before. It takes some work to get it started and get it going.
Okay, excellent. So I'm hoping we're going to have time to come back to this concept of hubbing through St. Lucia, because we have been talking about this. We had the proposal for a cul-de-sac industrial zone, which has altered. We've had the industrial zone in Viewford, which has slowed down a little bit, I think. But clearly, we have some of the infrastructural links that we need to develop that critical mass. If the market is in fact transforming and repositioning, then hopefully government action can follow. Mr. King, you mentioned energy costs and among some of the determinants. I wanted to ask, and hopefully generate some discussion. And other panelists, please, you don't have to sit there and wait for me. I mean, jump in if you can. Productivity of labor, and you're in manufacturing, has to be one of the efficiencies that we can build on, which of course will make our productive sectors more competitive. Could you speak a little bit about the productivity of labor, and particularly how we position our human resource in terms of what's happening in the fields of automation and artificial intelligence? And just so that we can make the link clear, I mean, we speak about inputs to the manufacturing process being capital, equipment, and the hard stuff, but there's also the softer side, which is the human element. And the cost of labor and what it produces is got to be one of the determinants of how price and competitiveness are moving. So if you could address that a little bit, we would be most grateful.
Okay, so you asked about productivity of labor. Yes, it is certainly manufacturers are no different to the other businesses in St. Lucia where it is a challenge for us to get the most productive out of our employees. The challenge we face is that we find that in terms of recruitment, when we try to get the best available, young minds, people who are ready to work. But we find that in terms of the skills required to do, to perform the skill tasks, we find that there is still a lot of training that's required. In other words, the workers that we get, they are not adequately prepared, from, I guess, the leading institutions to be ready to work. And, well, there are two aspects to it. One would be the actual skill, and the other would be the actual work ethic. So we find that recruitment is, getting the right people is becoming more and more of a challenge. The issue isn't really the wage rate at the moment. I think, although, I know there is discussion about a minimum wage. I will not really get into that except to say that while I am not, but I think the manufacturers generally are not against minimum wage, but we are aware that care must be taken in whatever decisions are made, because if, while the intention is to improve the, the ability of certainly maybe entry-level, low-level workers, to be able to help them to face the increased cost of living, but if the minimum wage causes a general increase in wage rates, then that in itself could cause further inflation, because then, of course, businesses would have to try to recover. But anyway, back to the question at hand. Yes, so productivity, getting the most productivity out of our employees is a challenge. We do what we can. As manufacturers, we provide the necessary training, but then the work ethic continues to be an issue. I think there needs to be an examination of really how well our young people are prepared in the learning institutions to enter the workforce to really be effective. Now, you asked about automation. Yes, now, automation certainly is effective at lowering the unit cost of production, and that's what we see happening in the developed countries. In a place like St. Lucia, it is not quite as practical, because automation is really only beneficial if you have the required scale of production. In other words, there is really a critical mass you must reach in production volume for automation to really be beneficial. Otherwise, it actually ends up being more expensive. Now, the way in which, St. Lucia has a relatively small population, so most local manufacturers would probably not be able to reach the required level of production volume if what they do is primarily supply the local market. So that means exports. Exports are critical for really the growth and success of any manufacturer locally. I appreciate the fact that the government, through Exports in Lucia, they've provided a lot of support to manufacturers, getting them ready, especially the small manufacturers, getting them ready to enter export markets. But while Exports in Lucia is helping, there are other agencies that at times create impediments to the easy flow of exports. I will not get into details, but these are things that sometimes concern us, and there must be a realization by all of the agencies, by the government and everyone else, that exports benefit everyone, so there should not be any kind of impediment. I think there should be full cooperation so that exports can be maximized. In terms of AI, yes, well, again, that is something that can improve productivity. In my opinion, I do not think as St. Lucians we are very quick to grasp. We are not among the first to grasp all of the technological advances. We tend to fall behind. I think COVID was an example. Well, in a way, I think one of the benefits of COVID was that it forced us to actually look at and apply a number of technological advances, especially in communication and other things that we otherwise would probably have ignored. So AI is the next, the AI is where the world is going, and I would not want us to be lagging behind as usual. We need to be among those who are eager to see how we can exploit it to our benefit. But we are not, as far as I'm aware, there is very limited use of AI, if any. So that's something we need to change locally.
Okay, so the minister and I believe Madam Master of Ceremonies asked us for unfettered discussion. I took that very seriously. So without putting you entirely in the fire, I would like you to give us one example of how we could have better coordination between government agencies that would impact your members in terms of keeping costs down, improving processes, and
there is, of course, we all know about the. Yes, we all know about the health and citizen security levy. I must say I appreciate the fact that manufacturers are appreciative of the fact that the government of St. Lucia agreed not to apply the levy on imported raw materials and packaging materials for the most part, because that would have driven up our production costs and therefore our prices. However, there is in the pipeline, there is legislation for, and of course I understand the intent of such a law. I understand it has merit, but it will invariably cause the cost of production for manufacturers who use plastic bottles to package their products. It will invariably cause those prices to go up. So that is something we are a bit concerned about, but there is a lot of dialogue. When I mention exports and impediments to that, I can probably give a little more detail. There are certain requirements that are sometimes placed on exports that do not necessarily, these are not requirements. So these are requirements placed by local agencies which would cause manufacturers to have to comply to certain things that are not required by the markets to which we are exporting. So I'm saying there is really no benefit to trade. It does not actually, it's not a benefit to anyone.
And it would push up your costs.
And yes, it can push up our costs. Sometimes it might not seem so obvious, but if it requires extra procedures, then it definitely brings up the cost.
Okay, so what you're saying is that we've got to look overall at the demands we're putting on the productive sector to comply, to adjust, etc., to pay or meet additional costs in terms of the competitiveness of their products.
Yes, and we should always consider relevance. Relevance. So I'm speaking of a situation where what is being the requirement that was imposed it's not relevant.
Okay, so maybe we'll come back to the business of conflicting policy agendas. and whether or not things are being considered across the broad macroeconomic spectrum or whether it's being considered on a ministry by ministry basis. We'll come back to that. Tekla, perhaps that's a good place for us to continue some of the points that you raised, particularly where you indicated,
Okay.
yeah, particularly where you indicated that all of us play different roles. So we are all producers of labor at the very least. We are all consumers. Some of us have multiple hats, and who we are sitting behind the desk may not be who we are at the supermarket. Or we're all taxpayers, we're all employees, and sometimes employers as well. Could you speak a little bit about those cross purposes in the context of your consumer-oriented functions?
Okay, so naturally a consumer is one who uses products or services. So in any angle that the discussion takes, the consumer is affected, be it a manufacturer, be it an employer, be it an employee. We have to look at how does inflation affect consumers. I mean, we have recognized that it's not a government of problem, it's a global problem, and the ministry have outlined some of the steps the government has taken to cushion that problem. But how does it affect us as consumers? We have reduced purchasing power, whether it's from a manufacturer buying raw materials or consumer purchasing from a retailer. As the prices and goods and services rise due to inflation, the purchasing power of money decreases. Consumers may find the same amount of money buy fewer goods, and as Jason said, as manufacturers, because those raw materials rise, they buy it. However, they have to cushion the cost of the increase to the consumers, and we speak in the case of molasses as a raw material to production of rum. It erodes savings, so it means an entrepreneur, a business owner, will feel some form of impact. That impact would also redound on the consumer meaning the person who does the purchasing of those goods or services. If the rate of inflation increases, then of course your purchasing power or your savings will decrease. Economies of scale. This can affect long-term financial goals and retirement planning. It impacts fixed incomes because, of course, as the increase of goods and services rise, we see that wages and salaries do not follow suit. It is not possible. This can affect long-term financial goals. This can affect the ability for persons to maintain their lifestyle, and also it can compromise a business person's choice of whether you increase your goods or services to follow or cushion the blow to ensure that you can maintain competitiveness and a consumer base. We see interest rates rising and the borrowing costs. Of course, loan sharks capitalize on that. We have several loan sharks that recognize that persons need to have alternative income, alternative forms of finance, and these interest rates rise. This puts a consumer into a poorer perspective because you must borrow to meet your standard of living. And we have impact on investments. Do you make a choice of investing at this time? While certain assets may provide a hedge against inflation, you have other fixed incomes that may not keep the pace of rising costs. And that can be an impact as well. You have shifts in consumer behavior. And from the National Consumer Association's perspective, one of the strategies we have embarked on is to educate our consumers. Education is very important, and advocacy. Under advocacy, we are now on a campaign to increase membership because with numbers you have a voice. We have seen it happen in 2001, 2002. The Consumer Association was advocating for a consumer protection bill. That was, government gave us the time of day. It was actually enacted in 2022 when this administration came into power. Again, it can only happen when you have persons who can advocate accordingly. In terms of consumer education, we want consumers to use objectivity in their spending. Spend on the things that you need, not the things that you want. That's very important for us. Budgeting is important. Financial planning is important. Making a choice as to where you can get the best value for your money is very important. So you look for institutions that may offer you discounts, institutions that may offer promotions. What is the best choice of your spending? Online, locally. These are very important for us as an association to ensure that our consumers understand that the inflation rates are nothing that we can control. Again, we have seen so many or heard so many examples of how it's affected by our macro environment. So we have to make a concerted decision in understand how we can mitigate against inflation by the choices that we make as consumers.
Excellent. So, difficult question, but I'm going to throw it out there anyway. As we shift our patterns of expenditure, our patterns of shopping, of buying, of borrowing, what do you tell your members, your consumers, about the cost of hire purchase, for example, where you're facing rates upward of 25, 30%? Do you advise them to delay expenditure? Do you advise them to reconsider that new purchase in the scope of other priorities? And also, considering that border taxes constitute a large percentage of the final cost of goods, are we in fact contributing to a situation where consumers cannot afford certain categories of expenses, and so they are finding themselves at the mercy of, say, hire purchase arrangements which have very high interest charges? What do you say to your people about that?
What I would say to my people, we have options. Again, it's choices. Consumers always have a choice. And that's one of the objectives of the consumer bill, our rights and our responsibilities and our choices. We have the choice to purchase in bulk. You purchase in bulk, you pay cheaper. I mean, the government have done...
the cash to purchase in bulk.
If they don't have the cash. It depends on what you want to purchase. Our stress as consumers is mainly food. Do we grow what we eat? We hardly grow what we eat. So our import bill will be high. And I have seen so many examples of where the Ministry of Agriculture have asked people to eat what you grow and grow what you eat. And we fail to do that as a country, as an economy. So we rely on importation of food, which is very costly. And of course, you can say, you must buy sardines. You don't have to buy sardines. You must buy pasta. You does not have to buy pasta. We can get starch and the carbohydrates we need from alternative sources of food that we can grow right here in St. Lucia. So we have a choice.
Actually, I just want to jump in and say that we produce pasta locally, so I think you should probably not use that as an example.
No, and even the local pasta we produce still has an exponential increase in price.
Yes, true.
Yes.
Well, thanks. We'll come back to that, I suspect, because I think that the cost of financing across the economy is something that bids up everything, as does the cost of trading across borders. We've ignored, or we've
Come back.
We've ignored Mr. Cox for a little while, and I see him edging to jump in. So feel free, Mr. Cox, to jump in. And as you do, would you talk to us a little bit about the basket of goods and whether that needs updating across the region so that we have a more accurate measurement of inflation, and whether or not there are initiatives in combating inflation that need to be addressed regionally? Are there things that individual and member countries would not do as well alone that they should be doing together? And maybe the shift in sourcing supplies may be one of those things. So what do we need to do together, and how does the basket of goods compilation get improved?
Well, to be frank with you, the answer to your first question is a simple word: yes. The baskets, by and large, baskets have to be recalibrated. We have to do the requisite household expenditure surveys. I would suggest those who that are out of date that they do so. You do have markets, for example, where persons would be referencing in the basket of goods items that, frankly speaking, demand is not really there anymore. The whole composition of it. If you look in some of the jurisdictions, you see rent being as low or household expenses being as low as probably 7-8%. The truth be spoken, anybody there in your audience, ask yourself a simple question: do you really spend 7% of your income on housing expenses, whether it be rental or mortgage or whatever it is? So that's one aspect of it. Now, in terms of what we can do, as I alluded to before, what we have to look at is, well, one, looking at the possibility of nearshoring, which is basically using our proximity. Because remember something, we are within a 6-hour flight radius of a market of, well, let's call it 250 million people, right? So we can, well, but we have also in a lot of the countries unused capacity, warehousing capacity, other sides of other aspects of it, whereby we can create the market to produce some of the elements that would at least be primary inputs into some of the manufactured goods, etc., etc. As we learned, for example, coming out of COVID, right? We had a scenario whereby we saw an upsurge in electronic commerce because people, because of the supply chain issues, persons weren't able to access some of the stuff that they usually use. But who were the, which were the, where were the primary, who were the primary beneficiaries of it? China, Japan, United Kingdom, United States. Part of our challenge within the region is that for whatever the reasons are, most of our businesses do not have a real online presence. That best, for some of them, they have like a static Facebook page, or for some they have absolutely no presence at all, much less having anything to deal with an electronic payments platform. So that's another aspect of it. What we can also do is that we also have facilities where we can do production integration. You have certain elements that can be done across border, and countries and markets need to, well, at least within the region, need to look at some of those aspects and see where the efficiencies can be brought to bear. The other part of it is that, and I know this is not probably the most comfortable conversation to have where this is where this obtains, but there is also an element of price gouging that is going on across our region. And we have to also safeguard against that. There are mechanisms that the state will have to ensure are effective to treat with some of these issues. Because honestly speaking, yes, the border taxes are an issue. Yes, you have other issues in terms of costs, in terms of electricity costs. Our region is notorious. We have the highest electricity rates across in the world. But the fact of life is none of that, and some can explain some of the substantial, and when I say substantial, rather than saying substantial, exponential increases that we have seen for some of the products. So the point that I'm making is that there is a lot of areas for improvement. When I hear, for example, we're speaking about what the consumer tastes. That's part of what we're trying to do here at CARICOM, because we started to look very seriously at how do we inculcate the behavioral sciences into policy making. Because, for example, one of our flagship programs, the 25 by 25 agriculture initiative, reducing your food imports by 25% by the year 2025. I would dare say that yes, that's on track, and all being well, we should be able to attain those goals. But if there is not a fundamental shift in the aggregate demand, in the actual taste, the demand and taste of some of our demographics, in terms of looking to using indigenous foods, albeit prepared in new ways, etc., etc., If we do not do that, then frankly, initiatives such as 25 by 25 could run into a challenge over the medium term. Because if the fundamental aggregate demand does not shift, then all that will happen is that whatever gains that we make can be compromised because people are looking for, are still gravitating towards the larger market. So, for example, most of us people would appreciate this point. You ask somebody, any of your children, frankly speaking, what they can identify with, and they can tell you about all the international fast food brands that obtain in the United States, etc., etc. But ask them about the local foods, and they probably look at you as if you're speaking Greek. So I just yield at this point, Chair, but I think your point, I think you can appreciate where I'm going with this conversation.
Yeah, I certainly do, and to a certain extent, I sympathize with your unexpressed frustration because we have been speaking about these things for some time. Meanwhile, we continue to be heavily taxed economies, we continue to be highly indebted economies, we continue to be generally low growth economies. And it seems to me, and I would like to focus on that a little, well, watching the time a little later in the discussion, as to how do we make structural changes in these economies, not temporary tinkering and short-term fixes, but how do we make structural changes in these economies to improve efficiency and productivity across the economy. We have adopted a pattern of having high border taxes, for example, which is a tax on the entire economy. At one time, and this could be verified, St. Lucia used to have the highest cost per container for both exporting and importing. And then we would complain that our manufacturing sector is not growing, is not robust, it's not resilient, but our costs are very high and our efficiencies are very low. Our productivity of labor continues to be a major problem. How are we transforming and repositioning these economies to perform better, to achieve higher growth rates, not just for poor people to survive, but for poor people to prosper? I think these are some of the long-term trajectories that we need to be speaking about. And while we address inflation as a temporary crisis, which has exacerbated because of the global circumstances in which the world finds itself, wars in the Middle East, etc., we still need, I think, to have that substantial discussion and that substantial strategy about what are we doing long-term to transform our economies and our societies into better places to do business and better places to live. So that addresses both the consumer side and the production side. If your manufacturing sector is not growing at the desired rate, there is a reason for it. It's not because manufacturers want to remain poor and inefficient. So we have to have these discussions, and I'm very, very glad and quite proud to be part of this measure. And as Minister said, having an unfettered discussion about what are the underlying issues here. Mr. Luisi, I'm going to give you first shot at that. And panelists, please, it doesn't always have to come back to me. Feel free to jump in with your points. All right?
Adrian, you touch on a pet peeve of mine.
Good.
Because this issue of, what do we want our country to be in 25 years? Not based on what is happening, where it will end up. Not projecting. It's maybe forecasting, saying, I want our country to be that way. And what do I then need to do? We had a wonderful opportunity, I think, after or during COVID, to look and say, where we are, clearly things are not working. That's not what we want. So let us reboot so we arrive at a different place. But we've reverted to some of the very same practices. Customs are now inspecting more containers than they did during COVID.
How does that impact? It's a nuisance, I'm sure, particularly if you're trying not to declare things. But if you are running a bona fide business straight up and doing all your paperwork and all your procedures, how does this impact you? And remembering that our subject is inflation, and I'm not suggesting any nefarious practices here. I'm just saying that if you're running a bona fide business and government decides to increase or customs decide to increase inspection rates, how does this frustrate your objectives as a business?
Your goods are in the container, on the port, and not on your shelves.
Okay.
Government is not collecting revenue because you have not paid the duty. It's still in the port. You're not selling your good because it is still on the port. You're paying taxes and you're paying cost. Every day it stays there extra. And that cost, the consumer is paying it.
Eventually.
Eventually.
Okay. So inefficiency then at that point in the process should reduce?
Inefficiency across all agencies that interact with the private sector and the business community. If these efficiencies are improved and inefficiencies eliminated, the benefit goes to the consumer. Ultimately. We also, just some of the comments that are made, I think sometimes we need to change it. My good friend, Dr. Dr. Samuel, was talking about how prices have moved over time. But that's a wrong impression, because the price is what the consumer gets. How have costs changed? Did we see the cost of the goods that came to St. Lucia at the port increase over time? If the prices increase and the cost remains the same, no, you use the term price. And I think we have to be very clear. When you say the price is the price the consumer feels, we have to see what the costs are. If the costs are increasing, ultimately the prices are increasing. We throw the phrase around price gouging. 2 weeks ago, the President of the Chamber said very clearly, our members do not engage in price gouging. You may not like the price. You may not like the price, but they're not price gouging. People go to a store and they don't like the price. I go to a lawyer, I don't like the cost, what he's charging me. Is he price gouging? I go to a doctor.
Mr. Moderator.
Order.
So I'm saying, we need to use the right language to get the right reason. We're talking about a simple example. You use pasta. And we said various reasons the cost of pasta has increased. And Danny gave the explanation. One of them that we sometimes don't think about. We have trade arrangements and agreements, Article 164, which says we need to support local manufacturers in a narrow line of goods. With Article 164, there are costs to it. There was a 75% tax placed on pasta. It went up. These are some of the things that happen. But we need to explain it so people could understand. And when it happens, you must tell them why we're doing it. We have a regional integration movement. We benefit from being together. And there are costs to it. We cannot only accept the benefits. We need to talk about that. My good friend spoke about the cost of labor, I think, and Adrian spoke about the productivity. We need to be pushing for a higher return to labor.
Explain.
You see, if I have a job to move this, and the result of moving this will be money. If Jason charges me $1 to move it, and I end up losing 50 cents because he's moved it, he's too expensive. If Adrian charges me $10, and when he moves it, I make $1,000, Adrian is cheap. The return to labor is great. So what we want to do is organize ourselves so that our processes, it's not just using technology, our processes are better. It infuses our workers with the capacity to make an impact. Too often, we have processes that are cumbersome, processes that don't make sense, processes that cause waste, spoil, pilferage. Also, so we need to work on processes, and these processes are within businesses as well as within the public sector. And we have to look at that. We talk about the 25 by 25 program. That's a fantastic idea. Sometimes I'm not sure if the analytic work is rigorous enough. So St. Lucia has a huge food import bill. how much of that food import bill goes towards feeding the local population?
Explain.
So we have 180,000 people, but we're feeding 1 million tourists every year. So we have to bring in 5 times as much food. So if we start producing what we eat, are we producing what the tourists eat? So we may have to accept that we will have a huge import bill to satisfy the tourists. What we then need to look at is how can we reduce that, first the element for local, but also that element by introducing them to substitutes. But we should not knock the fact that we have that import bill just because it's high. We need to analyze it, and if we analyze it, we can then resolve and achieve the things we want to achieve.
Okay, so your
Can I chime in,
your
Mr. Moderator?
Your point essentially is consistency of policy, broader approach, long-term objectives.
Yes, indeed.
Okay. Teka.
Mr. Moderator, since we have in an unfettered discussion,
Unfettered. That's what the minister asked for. Please give her what you asked.
as a consumer, I am opined that we do have price gouging, especially at the supermarkets. And we cannot pretend that it does not exist. Mr. Moderator, I am a shopper. I'm a consumer. You cannot get the same item at 2 supermarkets with one having double the price of the other. So, okay, did one get duty-free on the importation of goods while the other had to pay duties? Because they are both chamber members. They both have the same issues as everybody else, whether it be customs, taking long with the process of unpacking, but the prices are different. And I go as far as looking at, what you call it, spelt flour. One supermarket would have it $18.95, another one would have it $44.95. Isn't there price gouging?
Not necessarily. I mean, all
Same brand?
Yeah, but companies have different cost structures.
I understand that.
Brian was trying to explain as
But
well.
why would it be double?
I cannot tell you.
All right. On another note, I would go to a supermarket and buy local watermelon. The same farmer who sells the watermelon sells it by the road. $30 for the watermelon. Every time you go to the supermarket, the watermelon has a $5 increase. And I'm not speaking about imported watermelons. I'm speaking about local. There is price gouging, and we cannot hide from the fact that it happens. A phenomenal problem that we have in St. Lucia, and everybody sitting here who are either business owners, work for a business, or understand business, understands that our labor market is poor. And I believe it all stems from education. I am opined that the YEA program, Youth Economy Agency, has done a great justice to ensuring that young people turn their talents and hobbies into a business. Why can't it start at the schools? It has to be inducted and incorporated in our education system, because we have a universal education system. It means that everybody have to move through the ranks, go to secondary school. It's no longer what it used to be before. If you can make it, you'd go to a secondary school, and if not, you would probably go to the project. So everybody must move up. It doesn't matter what your educational capacity is, you go through the ranks. There will always be the technical students and the academic students. Those technical students are just left to the wolves. And they have to be between 15 and 35 now to benefit from the YEA program. Why can't such a program start from inception? I could remember going to Anglican school from stage 1. We had to bring all empty toothpaste boxes and cereal boxes, and we played shop. And they taught us exchange. They taught us merchandising from stage 1. These things do not happen in school anymore, but yet still the business people would say, oh, the labor market, we do not have persons who can produce, etc. And we know that productivity affects profitability. So as we look at inflation, labor market is a force. It's one of those indicators that will affect inflation and will affect businesses and the opportunity of, to have profitability and of course, to be able to afford to increase wages or salaries of their staff. If I do not make a profit as a business, where am I getting the bandwidth to increase wages? Even if you were to increase the minimum wage, how can I afford it if I do not have the right people to work to be able to bring that level of profitability? These are issues that we must bring to the table. Yes, we understand that the government is doing everything in their power to ensure that they can reduce taxes in certain areas that would cushion the blow of our economic growth and our business sustainability. But we still have the issue of how do we deal with the current labor market that we have. Children graduating from school. I interview children graduating from A-level, from secondary schools, and some of them are no more educated than some Form 1s and 2s. So we have to do something. If we want to improve our labor market, we have to start from the schools, because productivity will always impact profitability, and that will also lead to inflation. The government can give business people all the incentives that they want to be able to order and get things profitable. But if you do not have the right persons to produce, as Jason rightly said, even in production, as manufacturers, they feel it. But it's not only felt only in the manufacturing industry. I mean, I've seen Mrs. Kadase, she can tell you how often people pass through her doors. And as business people, we go through it all the time. You, Adrian, would be able to.
Retention is a problem.
Yes, thanks.
It's definitely a problem. Okay, so you are linking productivity of labor versus the cost of labor into the production schedule of inputs, and suggesting that if we had more productive workers, better trained workers coming out of the education system, that our businesses would be more proficient, more efficient, and therefore could keep costs down.
Yes.
In a nutshell.
Yes, in a nutshell, and could help with the inflation.
Anybody wants to
No, just before you go
chime
there,
in on that?
just before you go there, Tekla is perfectly right to have an opinion, but the St. Lucia Chamber of Commerce maintains that our members do not engage in price gouging. I have seen an example. Where a product on a shelf was one price simply because it was bought locally and there was a distributor markup and a wholesale markup on it. That person subsequently imported the product themselves where they didn't have that markup, and the price was almost half the price. Sometimes you have to ask questions. Sometimes I have seen when I go to the market, the price of potatoes, what I used to buy for $5 is now $10. Local products are going up because the consumer, who are the farmers, are facing increased costs of production of everything. So sometimes we see things we don't understand, but we shouldn't jump to the first conclusion of price gouging, and the chamber rejects that. So we could move on.
Well, I would like to say, in fairness, that
Chair,
I have seen examples where a distributor, for example, a wholesaler, would have passed on a price increase to a particular customer, and that price increase is reflected on the shelf today, and it has not, in fact, been passed on to another of their customers as a retailer, and so therefore you would see a difference. Even within, sometimes even within the same organization, you might see price differences. But it has to do as well with the price, with the cost structures. It has to do with pricing policy. It has to do with profit margins. I cannot rule on the matter. That's not my function here. All right?
And I'm not here to defend anybody, but I'm telling you as a fundamental principle.
At the end of the day, I think that and I'm a business person as well, and I don't know any business people who raise their prices without thinking about the impact it's going to have on their consumers and on their sales. So the business of raising prices, well, you know business people who raise their prices without thinking about the impact it's going to have on their sales? That's not a business person.
But they raise it for increased profitability.
Yeah, but if your sales are going to go down, then you lose, and you're excluding certain customers, then that is not a sustainable strategy.
Not when you have a monopoly on your goods.
Well, I don't
Not
think,
when you have a monopoly.
I think that's a simplified version, to tell you the truth, but let's move along. We are on the business of, we're going to open the floor shortly because we don't have a lot of time left, only half an hour by my count. We're on the business of what can be done long-term, structurally in these economies to avoid the issue of being so susceptible, so vulnerable to imported inflation. Mr. Cox.
Yeah, well, what we can be doing in the short to medium term is one, we have to look at one, moving up the value chain. So in other words, to the extent we produce primary products, we also have to be starting to look at processing of these products so we can go up the chain. One, two, I so fundamentally disagree with the previous speaker from the manufacturing sector, because part of what we have to be looking at is, for example, where you have your tourists, for example, and I'm no expert on St. Lucia, so I don't pretend to be, but if you have your tourists, because it's a general point across the market, if you have your tourists coming in, part of the things that we have to be starting to do is basically reintroduce the country's fare to the tourists. Obviously, change in taste and so on occur over time, but we have to start. Too many times we travel all over this region. And what you see there, you really wonder if you're in North America or you're in the Caribbean, right? And so when we look at that, and of course I have to, as a representative here from the Secretariat, speak to and really, correct any misapprehension that our 25 by 25 program does not have the rigorous technical analysis that underpins the decisions that are being made, are being put forward for the countries to adopt. Because the honest truth of it is that when we're looking at the production capabilities, the possibilities for production integration, in fact, we have gone as far as to have cross-border virtual agricultural extension services being offered. There's a level of the intervention that is being made. So what we have to do is we also have to take on board the use of the technology, not run away from it, not make excuses for it, but to embrace the technology and optimize it for our usage. And the last thing that I want to say on this score is when it comes down to the customs. Part of the challenge that we face is a double-edged sword, because in one respect, we do have unscrupulous people who abuse the process. So, for example, a case of, and I'm not speaking to St. Lucia, I'm speaking generally, a case of chicken back, what is supposed to be chicken backs and necks coming into a country. Right under the first layer of chicken backs and necks, suddenly occurred many breasts and thighs. In other words, a mechanism to avoid the duty. We know these things happen, right? And then of course you have the drugs that that creates a problem, and it works both on import and export. Because frankly speaking, when you have, for example, 100% container stripping, right, and you're exporting, say you vacuum seal, say for example you're sending out, I'm just going to use a random example, something like pantyhose, for argument's sake. You vacuum seal the container, they break the seal to check to see if that is really what you are saying is in there. But then sometimes the ports don't have the facilities to allow for the resealing of the container. So what started as a single container sometimes go up to container and a half kind of sort. So the point I'm making is that there are arguments on both sides of the equation, where because obviously the import costs and the costs at the port obviously will impact it. But at the same time, we cannot run away from the issue that you have people, unscrupulous people, take advantage of a situation. I've had situations, for example, here where I am in Ghana, where all of a sudden, if we weren't judicious in what we were doing, all of a sudden a ticket from Ghana to the Bahamas suddenly went up to 5,000 US. So let us not pretend as if these things don't happen. They may not be as widespread as some would like to believe, but the honest truth of it is that it does occur. And Chair, I do agree with you. Any business that tries to use that strategy as a longer term frame will not be in business for very long. But the sad truth of it is that you do have opportunists who utilize the scenarios to extract as much as they can out of a situation. And indeed, it really does constitute gouging. I rest with that, Chair.
I would
Thank you
like
for
to.
that. Yes.
Yes, I would like to speak briefly on this. Not really from a manufacturer's perspective, but just from general business perspective. There are times, of course, when you will see that that you have these price differentials, like what you mentioned. You used the watermelon example. I did mention earlier that, well, in the case of manufacturers, for example, sometimes when we are hit with significant increases on our input costs, we can't actually pass it on, at least not at the time. What tends to happen sometimes is we still need to pass it on eventually, for sustainability. Otherwise, eventually, we will simply be operating, in a loss position. So you will find situations where certain businesses, maybe they are hit with an increase, let's say on something that they buy locally and resell. But then they can't, maybe at the time, they can't pass it on, at least not all of it. But later on, they will pass it on. So you will see a mismatch. You'll say, oh, but the price I pay for that same item from the farmer, it didn't increase, and yet I'm seeing the supermarket is increasing. So sometimes that's one explanation, a delay in passing on an increase in cost. Another thing too is that the retailers generally have to, they have a kind of balancing act in terms of their overall margin. You will see that of course, there are a number of items they sell are price controlled, and or is otherwise essential, and they might not, maybe the margin they are earning on those is not enough, it doesn't meet their overall margin. They have to try to make that up on other goods that are maybe less essential. So they will, have a more attractive margin on those other goods. It doesn't, now I do not feel that constitutes price gouging because it's not particularly exploitative. It's only exploitative maybe if as you say, if there is a true monopoly and then they are forcing people to buy something that, like people don't have options. But I'm saying there is price control. The items that are considered essential, most of these, as far as I can tell, are subject to price control. So those items that you will see where there appears to be some kind of exploitation, I'm saying consumers have a choice. Sometimes, if there is not competition locally, then it's a matter of making a decision. Because, I'm saying consumers have more power sometimes than they realize. For example, if the price of watermelon is too expensive and people collectively decide, you know what, we're not paying for that, then the suppliers, those selling it will have no choice but to lower the price, or it'll stay there and spoil.
Consumers have a choice, but I want us to be mindful that the things that are conducive to consumers' health are the most expensive, and sometimes these are what the retailers take advantage of. It is cheaper to eat unhealthy than to eat healthy. And they usually play price gouging with the things we need to eat healthy. A packet of Concals, the prices have not changed apart from 1 cent or 2 cents. Is that healthy for our kids? No. The soft drinks that we manufacture in St. Lucia, you have seen no significant increase.
Price control,
maybe 5 cents.
Soft drinks.
And it's not price control. Maybe 5 cents or 3 cents. Have you seen it increase by $5 or $10? No. But those healthy foods that you need to consume, that's what they take advantage of, because you must eat it. Yes, we have a problem with diabetes and hypertension. We've learned that that's one of our biggest ills in the country. So the doctors will guide you to eat what's right. You think the little Maliway, the low-income earner, can afford to eat healthy? Unethical business practices go on, and we must not turn a blind eye to it. A typical example of unethical business practices. Supermarkets will say they do not give bags because they protect the environment. Environmental is very important to us now. We've changed it, climate change. They sell the same bags. Come on now. You all want an unfettered discussion? I'm giving it. They sell it, and of course, one supermarket boasted about their $7 million profit just in bags.
Yeah, I think it's important. I think it's important not to oversimplify certain things. There is a and I really don't want to get into the arbitration of issues among panel members, but there is a certain cost to the environment of waste and waste management and degradation of the environment. I believe that the logic of charging for a plastic bag or any other plastic is to discourage people, not to say that it's not a religious practice. It is to say there is a cost to it and you will think about how many bags you use. Whereas previously, all of us would go to the supermarket and we would use as many bags as we are given. So now we just have to think about it. And certainly part of the process is changing our thinking about how we consume, which is a point that Tekla has made very, very eloquently. Ladies and gentlemen, it is time to open the floor as directed by the program. So I would like an orderly show of hands. Thank you very much. We have the first taker. And remember that our subject is inflation. Let us try and be useful to ourselves and to the people listening to us on the media and the web. Okay, so we have our first question. If you want to direct it to a specific member of the panel, please feel free to do so. And also just give us your name and maybe your sector or your profession or some identification for the record. Thank you.
Flavia Cherry, St. Lucia Industrial and Small Business Association. First, I want to thank the government of St. Lucia for such a timely and important exercise. And thank you, Tekla, for sticking to that point. A few important observations and points I wanted to ask in terms of the private sector. You spoke about the opening up of potential markets from Mexico and Brazil. To what extent is the private sector willing to really push for that to happen? Because very often there's an expectation that government is going to do things, but we know that we would require the shipping lines. We know that we would require, for example, Guyana is an excellent point of entry in and out of Brazil. What is being done? Because if we just are aware of it and the next 5 years we are just aware of it, then nothing can happen. But perhaps the private sector can get together and invest in a shipping line, invest in regional travel, because one of the biggest problems for the small business sector is trying to get goods just around the Caribbean area. If you have to get goods to St. Kitts, it has to go to Miami first. So at what point is the private sector going to invest to make this happen? This is one point. The other one, I really want to speak to, and members specifically requested that we do that, especially members in the business of canteens and restaurants, are really frustrated with what appears to be price gouging. And just to give an example, to what extent, if you have a retailer with only 2 outlets, one in the north, one in the south, can sell the same item at $40 when the bigger ones that have the economies of scale are selling that item for $85. There are so many examples, and they actually went and compared the prices so that we could make that point and make it very emphatically. And if the point is not to frustrate the consumer, then what then is the point? There may be some other clandestine objective of what is going on, and it needs to be addressed. And we want the government to do something seriously about the price gouging. The other point we want to make is the importance of the transition to renewables. This must be accelerated. Members are making an effort to get into solar, although we are told that there are concessions on solar, but it should be across the board, because when you go and import the product, you are told that you have to go through the broker and you have to apply, and it is not applicable across the board. So we are asking for solar to be, for there to be concessions across the board, and for it to be easier to access whatever concessions are available, because members are still finding that when they go to clear the goods, they have to pay still a lot more to get it in. The other point I wanted to make is with regards to the importance of planting what we eat and eating more local food. This is a very critical and important point, and especially when we look at what is happening in the world today with Ukraine. And I mean, at what point are we going to recognize that we need to find every mechanism and way forward to encourage young farmers encourage young men to get into farming. We have, since there's no agricultural association, we have several farmers into our association, and what they're saying is not a lot of young men are willing to get into that. How many young men are willing to go and work under an existing farmer? But the young men are willing if they get the incentive for input, and there are several areas where government land is available. If they get access to that government land, you would be surprised how many young men would go into farming as farmers, as entrepreneurs in their own right. So we want to encourage the government to get into the farming. That was it. This was my
Thank you very much. Thank you very much. So considering the time, we want to maybe limit ourselves to one substantial point for those people asking subsequently. Panel, some responses, please, from Ms. Cherry.
First point to raise, as far as exploring Latin America, at our AGM, we use the tagline that the members are shopping the world for you. So already we have noted a number of members are already buying stuff from Latin America. In particular, Mexico, the point was raised that a lot of refrigeration equipment and material that a company inherited was actually from Mexico. So there's that. And we are actively working with the Mexican embassy for us to chart a way forward. They have promised to work with us to do a business mission, either to St. Lucia or to Mexico. So we're actively exploring that, and we are putting our members in touch with our contact at Apex, who's working through Guyana to look at some of the goods that they're already exporting. I cannot explain price differentials. I'm not here to pick up and say, well, this person is doing that, that person is doing that. But we will certainly raise the matter with our members. But I reiterate that there are times where we don't like the prices, and I always tell my members, my wife knows the price of the things in the supermarket better than them, and she has complaints. But we certainly will look and see what is happening and ask members to explain some of these differentials. I can't talk about the timing of investment and shipping, but there is an ongoing regional group looking at shipping issues and looking at establishing a regional shipping line. So that discussion has started at the ECCB and is continuing.
Any other panel members want to weigh in quickly on the specific issues?
Just quickly about the shipping and investment in maybe a regional line. The reality is that once there is a good business opportunity, then businesses will actually be attracted to it. When you see that there isn't, as if no one is making the investment, it's usually that there are certain constraints or impediments. So I think maybe regionally, the regional bodies can look to see what needs to be done to make it more attractive. It might not necessarily be businesses from the region that do it. You find those from outside that are eager to come in. Once there's a good opportunity, then you can be sure that it will be taken up. So it just means that we need to see what is hindering that desire for investment.
Okay, good point. Market-driven forces. There tend to be rational economic explanations for most things that happen in economies, and sometimes I think we neglect to look at all the factors driving consumer behavior and driving investor behavior or even business behavior. Sometimes it's very easy to jump onto one conclusion. We've got to broaden the discussion beyond that, I think, to consider other factors.
There's one point that Ms. Sherry made regarding encouraging farming, and that brings me back to the point that Mr. Cox made when he said 25 by 25. We can put a lot of emphasis in growing locally. I heard Brian said earlier that what do we do with the million tourists who come? So it means that we must import. I was a tourist in Nairobi, and I didn't see anything that I knew. I had to eat the food that the Africans cook, the chapati and all the different names. There was no potatoes, there was no baked beans, there was nothing that I could have related to in St. Lucia. Did I starve? No. I adopted to the culture and I ate what they grew and what they had at the high-end hotel. I had to ask the chef, can I get eggs? There were no eggs available. I had to eat what they had. So we can adopt that philosophy. And that particular hotel has a 99% occupancy all year round. So we can encourage, as Ms. Sherry said, farming, create opportunities for our young men and women, who want to get into it. We have, I guess, several crown lands or areas that we can encourage that type of industry. And we can get to 25 by 25 if we really move to that direction as a country.
I think that's a valid point, and I think it was Mr. Cox who raised earlier the business
Yes.
of changing tastes and aspirations so that we have a better match between what we are producing and what we are offering.
I just want to jump in very quickly. Just to say that it's ultimately it's the hotels that decide what they want to purchase, like in terms of food and other produce. Where we, as manufacturers, what we've appealed for in the past is for government to perhaps tie the incentives that the hotels ask for when they come to operate. These should be tied to certain requirements to buy local. So if they are incentivized to do so, I think they will.
I think that's a very useful point. In the incentive legislation of some CARICOM countries, you do have a correlation between local purchases, local expenditure vis-a-vis imported expenditure by way of measuring what the sector is contributing. And that gets balanced by the incentives granted. So that's a very progressive approach. Changing behavior. Yes, we know that the hotels, as all businesses, will decide what they are offering, but what is the destination offering, perhaps, as an experience, as an authentically St. Lucian experience, is something that government and other agencies have control of and can influence. Mr. Cox, as we get down to the wire, do you want to weigh in? And I say that asking as well, does the floor have any other issues? So, Mr. Cox, a quick input from you, and then we will go back to the floor.
No, my central theme is basically this: we need to reintroduce our people to our indigenous foods if we want to treat with that. That's one level. Two, we also have to look at some of our legislative interventions that will be required. So, for example, where we have, for example, the push on for transitioning to alternative sources of energy and, for example, electric vehicles, to look at legislation to see how we can treat with that in the face of the monopoly providers of electricity, monopoly generation as well as distribution of electricity. So what are some of the things we have to deal with to treat with these things that can help to reduce our effective overall costing? But is it that the challenge we face is insurmountable? Absolutely not. But the fact of life, it will take some adaptation to new technologies, new strategies, and of course, good old hard work.
Thank you very much. Yes, from the floor, if you would use the mic and introduce yourself.
Mrs. Kadas.
Yes, Mrs. Kadas.
Good morning, Sylvia Kadas. I want to ask, we tend to think that goods coming out of Mexico and Brazil will not be of the same standard that when it comes from the States. I find, and that's my personal opinion, that carnation coming from South America does not taste like any carnation that I have tasted. If you taste the carnation coming from the big countries, as opposed to coming from South America, there is a difference.
As in better or not better?
Well, in my opinion, there's an aftertaste. There's this strong aftertaste. So what I'm asking is that while you go venturing to Brazil and Mexico, will the standards be the same as when they export to America?
Brian, I think that's yours.
Well, I think we will not import things that don't meet the standards that's set out by our Standards Bureau.
Yeah, but who is...
But the quality and the preference will be decided by the market. So, for instance, we have had instances where companies have tried to introduce new brands and new products, and they're not successful because the consumer, even if they're not as costly as the favorite brands, so really the consumer. So what we want to do is to ensure we always have choice. You have variety available, you have different pricing points for the products. So that question, it will be determined by the consumer when you go to explore it.
Yeah, but my point is who is going to guard us before it gets to us? Are there going to be standards? Are we going to ensure that it is our standard that even that we can drink, or even that we
but the Bureau of Standards, the Bureau of Standards has standards in place that regulates what can come into St. Lucia, because anything you import, you must meet the Bureau of Standards. They have the standards. So we depend on the.
So the lights that are catching on fire were not inspected by the lights. Don't you always hear they are us talking about don't buy these lights because were they not inspected by the?
Well, I would hope that the Bureau of Standards sets the standards, and at the customs, if it doesn't meet the standards, it is not allowed in. If people bring them in or they're not inspected, they have these problems. The Bureau of Standards issues a recall and puts out a statement so that we no longer have them available on the shelves.
Okay, we'll see.
Okay, so I just want to. No, I'm not cutting you off. I'm not cutting you off. I'm just making the point that government authorities can regulate standards. They cannot regulate taste.
Taste of quality.
So I guess the meeting point between your point and Brian's response is that in terms of quality, yes. In terms of consumer taste, we must allow the market to decide, which is a fair interpretation.
Yep.
On the question of electrical goods specifically, which pose a hazard to public safety, etc., I think that is squarely back with the Ministry with the Standards Bureau to ensure. And the question might be, do we have legislation to enforce those standards post-sale and after consumption so that importers and suppliers, manufacturers of these goods, are held responsible or liable for the.
Yeah, the Consumer Protection Act speaks clearly to how you deal with.
Thank you, Brian.
And who will guard the gods? Who will guard the gods?
You have to guard the standards.
And that's just an observation. We have thought about it, and I'm wearing the hat now of the Vice President of the Bakers Association. And one of the things, and I agree with Mr. Key, that we have found and we have been discussing it and hope to meet with Ministry of Commerce and Ministry of Tourism, that who actually gives the concessions, the government, but the concessions come from the country. And we have found that in our industry that hotels only take bread from us, basically. But bread keeps you afloat. But where the profit is in desserts and cakes.
Other baked goods.
And we have thought that government should insist, as part of the concessions, that they take a percentage, they can work with us. If they find that our standards do not meet their standards, that it should be that they work with us, work with the bakeries, and whatever, that we can produce for them. And so it can then cut the importation bill, because that is a vast, and not only that, grow businesses. And then businesses will be able to give livable wages.
Excellent.
Sure.
So I think that will be the nature of and the subject of the next panel, which is going to be convened very shortly by the Ministry of Commerce and the Ministry of Finance. But clearly there is a need for this sort of open, enlightened discussion.
Yes.
I think that we have raised before, and I would just like to touch on it again, the business of whether or not all the left hands and the right hands are working together. And that applies across the macroeconomy as well as within government as well. There are many times when business people are asked to do something by way of record keeping or availability of information or even application for concessions, which is diametrically opposed to what another ministry is asking you to do. And very often it does not make sense. And very often you have revisions to existing practices which are in fact retrograde. They're taking you into unnecessary expense and procedure, and it has a cost. It has a cost in efficiency, and it has a cost sometimes in real bottom line to it. We're taking comments from the floor. If there's anybody, by a show of hands, we're actually past the 12:30 deadline. If there's one more comment, we can take it. If not, then I would ask for very brief closing remarks from our panelists. Going once, going twice, and we are closed. Thank you very much, Brian. In reverse order, Mr. Cox.
Yes.
So Brian, you'll have the last word. I dare not let Tekla have the last word. Mr. Cox, over to you, sir, for closing remarks, very briefly. Okay.
The mic, maybe. Where's the mic?
So Tekla, would you go there?
Okay, in closing remarks, I would like to remind consumers that we all have a choice. It's important that you compare prices for the best deals that you can get on goods and services, taking into consideration that sometimes we do not even have a choice in paying for the costs that we want. But however, it's important to look for promotions, loyalty programs, consider buying in bulk. I would love to also oblige the Ministry of Commerce to increase the time frame of the barrel concessions. Probably that might cushion consumer ability to eat what they can afford, since it would be much cheaper than the price gouging. We also want consumers to educate themselves. Education and awareness is very important. Stay informed about economic conditions and how they may impact your personal finances or your spending power. Understand the factors contributing to inflation, which is the main discussion here, and its important effects or its potential effects on different aspects of the economy. When we do understand and we educate ourselves and we become more aware, it gives us the power of spending, the power of saving, and the power of making informed and right decisions. And of course, the Consumer Association is always open to memberships. With numbers, we have strength, and we can become a better advocacy voice on ensuring that as consumers, we are not disadvantaged in any way. Thank you.
Excellent summary. Thank you, Tekla. Although you did slip in the price gouging again.
Yes, yeah.
You just couldn't help yourself.
I did mention it.
Mr. King.
Okay, thank you everyone for giving me this opportunity to be here to really speak on behalf of manufacturers. And I have explained at least some of the challenges, the many challenges that manufacturers have faced in terms of inflation and being able to provide our goods at prices that would be acceptable to the public. There are certain things that we are looking to do, sometimes with the support of the government and sometimes collectively as a manufacturing group. But I can say this, I had mentioned earlier that the higher production volume, which really requires higher sales volume, the lower our unit cost. Where the public can help, in fact, is by supporting local, by buying more local items. You would actually enable local manufacturers to effectively have a lower unit cost. So, in fact, because ultimately, as manufacturers, local manufacturers, we want to really be in a position to provide a more affordable alternative to the imports, because we cannot control the price of these imports as they rise. What we can aim to do is to control the price of our locally produced goods so that you have an affordable alternative. Thank you.
Thank you.
Yes.
Mr. Cox, can you hear us now?
I like the way you pinned that.
We were giving you an opportunity for closing
Yes,
remarks.
yes.
Brief.
The internet has not been my best friend today at all. In terms of what I would say in terms of closing, what we need to do is that we need to look to new opportunities. And when I'm saying that, I'm talking about
We seem to have a little seepage. Somebody's mic. Go ahead, please.
no, when I'm talking about, we can be looking. solutions like joint procurement, cross-border procurement where applicable, looking at, as I said, looking at some legislative fixes, also looking at increasing the upskilling that obtains within our sectors to make sure that people are availing themselves of the newest technology, newest techniques, etc., to drive efficiencies within the market. But as I keep saying, we are impacted by externalities. I mean, the extraordinary freight costs that was visited on this region. There's not a whole lot we could have done. But now going forward, we can embrace concepts such as nearshoring, not just necessarily looking to Mexico, but looking within our region for parts of some of the destinations, and also place a little more emphasis on reintroducing our local population and indeed our visitors to what is the local fare in terms of food stuff. So I will rest there, Chair, with my thanks for inclusion in this panel.
Thank you, Mr. Cox. That leaves Brian.
In conclusion, I just wish to thank the ministry once again for hosting this forum. As you know, the Chamber had long suggested that we need to strengthen public education, and we need to open the discussion, because resolving these challenges faced by our countries is not to zone in on a prescription solution. I think we need to open our eyes to all the facets and look at all the various areas we could tackle. We certainly think that there is need to support the consumers. We think there's need for government to look critically at how you tackle the most vulnerable. Maybe targeted safety net programs would be most useful. We think that the support of the agricultural sector to expand local production is also a program that we need to follow through. And the Chamber will certainly participate and support all efforts. Our members will continue to shop the world to meet the needs of our clientele. And we think that as a critical partner, we should not forget the impact of policy on the business community, because they too are facing escalating costs and prices across the board. Thank you.
Thank you, Brian. Thank you, ladies and gentlemen. You've been listening to a discussion and presentations on the issue of inflation, the vexing issue of inflation, which affects both producers and consumers across most economies. By way of history, inflation really rocked the world first, well, in recent history, in post-war Germany, when hyperinflation demonstrated that this was an evil to be avoided at all costs. In fact, it shapes German macroeconomic policy to this day, where they are probably the staunchest anti-inflationary policy drivers in the European Union to date. We've had other examples of hyperinflation closer to home in Venezuela, for example. Kenya has had issues as well. And we do not want to have those sorts of economic results here. We want to have an economy in which prices and costs increase at a manageable, affordable rate. Just to reiterate the presentation by the Ministry of Finance, a generally acceptable rate of inflation is considered to be around 2%. Some inflation is important because it helps to grow economies. It is part of the economic model of most economies, that you have an inflation rate with a general increase in prices, which is also a general increase in assets, which is to say that your savings are growing, the value of your house is growing, the value of your land is growing, and yes, other costs are also going on a gentle, manageable trend. So inflation is something it's not intended that it should be eliminated. It's intended that it should be managed healthily in an economy where it helps to grow rather than frustrate growth objectives. I think this has been a valuable discussion. I think it is one that should continue, both in practice and in subject matter. We are too isolated in this country and having conversations in silos, thinking that each of us is right, and each of us forms opinions based on our own perceptions and observations, and sometimes without listening to the other parties in the discussion, in the conversation. We're all entitled to our perspectives, but they should be informed, they should be objective wherever possible. And this is what discussions like this help to foster. We don't need to agree, but we certainly need to converse. It would have been nice to have had a little bit more time to talk about some of the fundamental things that we can do to reposition our economy to be less vulnerable and to be less dependent on imported goods and services, which is where, in this particular instance, a lot of our inflationary trends are coming from. Our inflation, the current inflationary trend, as was explained, has been exacerbated by global circumstances, Ukraine, the Mideast, post-COVID supply chain problems. But they have sort of settled with us because our resilience to those price increases, our ability to counter those price increases which are coming from abroad, has not been as strong as it should be. So if we had, for example, in the Eastern Caribbean, a greater control of our monetary policy, governments would have more levers to change. But as it is, we do not have active monetary policy. So we're almost forced to deal with inflation from a purely fiscal point of view, and there are limited tools in the hands of governments to do that. But there are some fundamental things that we have pointed to in this discussion, and I will just list them very briefly. And preface that by reminding us that government is $1.8 billion annually, 1.6, $1.8 billion annually in this very small economy. That is a huge chunk of resources. And it is really important that the government see itself as a primary shaper as opposed to a primary taker of economic circumstances. That position, I believe, is one that is well worthy of discussion. How do we maximize the economic impact of the $1.8 billion that the government, and I use the word advisedly, takes out of the economy every year? How do we maximize, how do we optimize the impact of that money? Because it is coming, tax revenue comes from somebody else. It doesn't come from the government. It comes from somebody else. It comes from economic transactions in the economy. So if we're taking that money out of people's pockets, out of people's bottom line, what are we doing with it to shape the economy and move it in the direction that it is supposed to be moving, which should be one, I think, of growth and investment and employment, rather than a survival sort of mode and a temporary measure and a tinkering sort of mode. How do we reposition? How do we transform? I think this is the substantive discussion that needs to take place. And inflation needs to be seen as an impediment to a longer goal, to a long-term strategy of where we really, really want to be as a country. And therefore, when we address it, we will be looking at longer-term issues, and this brings me to my closing point. So we have issues like border taxes. Do they contribute to inflationary trends? If the cost of a container increases, as we saw on the chart, from $4,000 US to $14,000 US, a substantial amount of that impact is actually government revenue. And that needs to be put on the table. So government's revenue, calculated on cost, insurance, and freight, quadrupled in that single component of a container cost going up. There's nothing to do with the value, the intrinsic value of the goods in the container, but government revenue, which is part of that extraction of $1.8 billion, is driven for no other reason, for no domestic reason, than the fact that the cost of moving a container internationally has increased. Port charges we spoke about. We have a monopolistic arrangement at our port, and any inefficiency there translates into a taxation on every single one of us insofar as it increases the cost of goods coming into our country. Energy, our energy policy, our green policy, these are things that I think long-term we need to be looking at. It has come up more than once. What are we doing about that? Can we have a discussion about it? Again, how do we reposition and transform so that we can reduce the impact of external energy costs on our development, on our consumption patterns? The productivity of labor, probably the most ticklish issue, apart from price gouging, that we need to consider. Are we producing the kinds of people who are going to create the kinds of efficiency and productivity that we need in our economy? Again, to be more reliant, to be more self-sufficient, so that we're not importing inflation all the time from other economies. What do we produce for a day's labor? What do we produce? Because a day's labor affects every single one of us, whether you're a carpenter, a mason, an economist, or a brain surgeon. What you can produce in 24 hours vis-a-vis what other countries are producing in 24 hours has everything to do with what your cost structure is going to be and what your price on the shelf is going to be. And your international competitiveness affects everything. It affects your exports, your imports, and your growth. Efficiencies in the system, particularly in government, we mentioned that as well. This is an important review that needs to take place. Are we asking our producers to do things consistently? Record keeping, accountability, compliance, etc. And moving up the value chain, which I think was mentioned by Mr. Cox. If we don't move the conversation from survival and getting by, if we don't move that conversation from poverty alleviation to wealth creation, we're going to be having this discussion over and over and over again. Are we positioning our economy for wealth, for prosperity? We've got to stop thinking of ourselves at the bottom of the food chain. We've got to move ourselves up market. Our tourism sector has done it quite successfully, with room to grow, of course. But we have not gone into the mass tourism market, and we've managed to have a Caribbean product which is generally suited to what we have to offer, with room to grow, room for improvement. So what can we learn from our tourism sector that helps move other aspects of our economy up the food chain? So moving from primary production in agriculture, which we have been talking about for ages and ages and ages. And yes, I'm that old, to remember what are we actually doing about it. And this comes back to the regional collaborations that we need to create in order to have the synergies across the region, because we are small economies and we must combine to have effectiveness. Price sensitivity is one of the things that can be addressed by moving up the food chain, so that our products are not so price sensitive and they can withstand fluctuations in the general price level. That means that we continue to be demanded, our product continues to be demanded irrespective of minor fluctuations in price levels globally. We've touched on fair competitive practice. I think this is something that needs to be further explored, and the business of rates of interest by financial institutions, very tangentially touched, but something that is also very, very important. Consider, for example, that if you have high border taxes that make white goods, which was mentioned, fridges, stoves, appliances, fairly basic things now, makes them so expensive that you have to use consumer credit to buy them, then you're increasing the cost of that basic appliance, a fridge, a stove, a washing machine. These are not luxuries anymore. If government policy is increasing the price of those things to a point where they have to be financed, then the price to the consumer is going to be 30% more than it should be on an annual basis. And these are some of the policies that we need to be looking at to see if we are driving our people upward or downward in terms of their wealth. And I think it is time to change the conversation from poverty alleviation, which tends to be a national mindset, to actually wealth and growth and prosperity. And on that, ladies and gentlemen, I am very happy to bring our discussion today to a close, and to thank once again both Ministries of Finance and Commerce for initiating this exchange, this dialogue. I wish we had more time. And to acknowledge the Minister's presence for a minute. I thought she would not have been with us for the duration, but she has reappeared, and it is wonderful that she's here with us to hear firsthand some of the concerns from both the floor and the panel. Thank you very much, and I trust there's lunch.
Is there a vote of thanks, Adrian? Is there a vote of thanks? Is there a vote of thanks?
Yes. Well, I've closed the panel.
Okay.
I didn't close the entire session.
Okay, so we can step out?
No. You gotta be rules, right? Yes. So, A vote of thanks will now be given by Mrs. Wendy Frederick, Director of Consumer Affairs. Over to you. Oh, we have a mic here. You want this one?
Pleasant good morning to all.
Afternoon.
Oh, afternoon. Oh my goodness. Please allow me to adopt the protocol already established. I must say we had some interesting discussions. We almost had to out the fire. And it's very interesting. And when you look at our mission statement as the Ministry of Commerce to actively promote and facilitate together with the private sector the establishment of a dynamic business environment which anticipates changes in global circumstances while strengthening and enhancing the productive capacities and competitiveness of industry and commerce, encouraging good business practices and consumer interest. So, thank you. So we see where the Ministry of Commerce, where we have to balance business and consumer interest, right? So I want to say thank you to the Prime Minister, the Honorable Philip J. Pierre, and the government of St. Lucia for providing the opportunity to have this discussion in such a forum and for continually ensuring consumer education and welfare. I would like to particularly thank our Minister, the Minister of Commerce, the Honorable Emma Hippolyte, for her support as always. And as Thomas Jefferson, I believe, who said, the purpose of government is to enable the people of a nation to live in safety and happiness. Government exists for the interest of the governed and not the governors. I like this statement. To our Permanent Secretary, Mrs. Sophia Alfie Henry, for leading the charge, directing and ensuring that everything was executed with excellence as usual. It is indeed a privilege to propose a vote of thanks and acknowledge the contribution of those who worked hard and participated to make this timely and necessary initiative possible. This event could not have happened overnight for sure, and the wheel started moving weeks ago with much research and planning, and we have been fortunate to have had the support and collaboration of the dedicated staff of the Ministry of Finance and the Ministry of Commerce, Ms. Lafay and her team, who are well versed in the area of expertise. I'd like to say thank you for a detailed and thorough presentation. To Dr. Samuel, thank you for the great insight, of course, on the micro perspective and providing a clearer understanding. I'm sure we're all more enlightened after these presentations. And to our in-house panelists, of course, Dr. Tekla Fitzlewis, Mr. Brian Louisi, and Mr. Jason King, and the Assistant Secretary General, Mr. Joseph Cox, attending virtually. I would like to thank you immensely for your invaluable contribution and informative discussions. Indeed, we have garnered much from their expertise. Right? We agree to that? Let's put hands together. Thank you to our moderator, Dr. Adrian Oje, for your guidance and, of course, doing it with your usual charisma. I would like to, of course, thank the staff of the Ministry of Commerce for organizing, coordinating, and aiding in publicizing this event. I would like to particularly thank the staff of the Consumer Affairs Department for their usual support. I don't believe the word or words have been formed that will allow me to attribute them the praise that is due to them as it relates to their participation and willingness to always complete tasks beyond their comfort zones. And thanks to the media, of course, and technicians for the live broadcast, and all your assistants. I would like to especially thank Mr. Glenn Simon in the back, the communications specialist attached to the National Productivity Council, NCPC, for unselfishly lending his expertise. And of course, that was done on short notice. And I want to thank his director, Mrs. Lisa Montoot, for loaning him to us. Let's put hands together for Glenn. To all participants, the general public, both in-house. Oh yes, I did, the Ministry of Commerce, Janine. Of course, Janine, thank you, our information officer, for working so hard. Yes, and putting all of this together, thank you. And of course, to all our participants, the public, both in-house and virtually, thank you for joining us and for your general contributions. Thank you all here for being with us today. And I pray that you have a wonderful day ahead. And I would like to say a very Merry Christmas and a Happy New Year. Thank you. Oh, and we have refreshments. We know it's lunchtime, it's 1:04, but we have refreshments in the back, so let's indulge and enjoy.